tech stack. There's also the generative AI stack, dare I call it. There's the infrastructure layer, which picks and shovels were where we were at for 23, 24. Yes. And you were there because you'd seen cloud and you'd gone into the data center perspective. But now everyone's wondering about, it's not just about LLMs, it's about the application layer. From your perspective, how are you looking at where evaluations build and where value accrues in 2025? Is it the same game plan? Is it still data centers and NVIDIA?
Well, I think so. NVIDIA, AMD, data centers, this was the picks and shovels that allowed us to get to where we are now, where predictive intelligence is now becoming generative. And I think our focus has really been on these application layer companies where there's an ability to really create enhanced customer experience, enhanced employee efficiency, and products. A company like Writer allows you to create first draft presentations through AI. It's creating enormous productivity. A company like 11 Labs, which is text to voice. Think about a streamer who produces a movie and wants to release it in 100 different companies like that. The ability to allow this real value creation in the business world and these workflows is the focus for us. We obviously are paying very close attention to the LLM race that's underway right now, and it's fascinating and amazing. It's hard for us to put capital there given where the valuations are. We tend to stick to our roots. It's a little bit of family office DNA. We hate losing money, and so we try to underwrite to businesses that have incredible tech teams, have incredible product roadmap, have customers, have something that's working, generating ARR, and we can see a really clear path to growth. And so that playbook, which worked in software, companies like Snowflake, Datadog, ServiceTitan, Adyen, Procore, we're hoping is working with AI. But also, just to be very honest, despite having spent countless hours looking at AI companies, I think we've looked at a couple thousand in the last 2 years. We've actually only written 12 checks to native AI companies.
12 out of thousands.
12 out of thousands of companies we looked at.
And what's so interesting, you think about a Snowflake has made such pivot with its CEO Sridhar coming from almost a generative AI startup to then build and where the new future of Snowflake. I don't know if you know May Habib at Writer, but I think she might beat any of you and even you in terms of air miles. This woman is flying in between London and San Francisco basically on the week. And that's where I want to go in terms of geography here, because what are you seeing in terms of 11 Labs, Writer, where this tech talent is? Is it all about American exceptionalism, or is it everywhere because you're a global company?
Yeah, so we are a global company. We have offices in Singapore and London, the Bay Area, and New York. We have invested all over the world. Of the 12 native AI businesses we've invested in, a quarter are outside of the US.
Oh, wow.
11 Labs is an example. Our view remains extremely global still. I think we saw that software and that migration to the cloud I mentioned earlier really afforded the ability for an entrepreneur to start a company anywhere, as long as you had access to Wi-Fi. I think AI is slightly different in that the technical expertise and the team needed and the access to this infrastructure makes it somewhat more limited, but innovation's coming from all over the world. And I think the US does not have the only game in town. I think you look at DeepSeek and what happened just a few weeks ago, that's a very real deal. And I think we're going to start to see incredible innovation come more globally very fast.
You must see round corners. Were you surprised by DeepSeek? Were the people you're speaking to surprised by it?
I think everybody was surprised by DeepSeek. Really? And I think when the sort of cover came off, and it was became aware to everybody, I think there was both a surprise in how quickly they were able to catch up, but I think there was also a lot of, the key takeaway was they can make this technology for cheaper than our models.
Yeah.
And this wake-up call around efficiency versus our brute force spending.
Yes.
I think that's a big wake-up call. And the other thing, speaking with a CEO recently who's deeply involved in this area, was he felt that there was a clever cunningness to their technology, meaning like there's a lot of innovation and origination coming as well. So I think this innovation is global. It's happening all over the world, and it's just going to continue that trend.
And what's interesting is when we think about global diversification, there's also diversification of what you're building for the founders and families that you've worked with for so long. Look, 2024 was marked by basically just 7 companies making up most of the public sector gains. Are we going to see a breadth again? And how do you ensure that you've got diversification across that whole generative AI stack, or indeed not just in generative AI, but other things too?
Yeah, well, I think when you look at the two sort of channels, right, you have the large language models, and right now there's the debate between open versus closed. Yeah. I think that debate is going to be a very interesting one to watch. I think when you see what happened with DeepSeek and you see what's happening with Llama, the open architecture model seems to intuitively make sense and allows for more players to get into the game quickly and more efficiently. The closed model is going to be hard. You have to raise tens of billions of dollars on a go-forward basis, right? Everyone's talking about spiking the ball in the end zone and getting to AGI. There will be multiple winners in this space, but they're going to continue to evolve and try to outsmart the next player. And so the amount of capital taken bodes well for the open model.
Will that capital remain resilient, do you think? Will that capital still be there, maybe more from the institutional strategic investors that are Amazon and Alphabet rather than private?
I think the capital is going to stay prevalent. What's interesting, though, about, say, a Llama or even ChatGPT or OpenAI is that they have these consumer products and there's revenue coming in that can also fund the growth. And I think that makes the products, more interesting and the financing more sustainable.
What about sustainability here? Because that's also the unique thing that Iconic offers here, is that you're thinking about helping that pool of talent, that pool of unique vantage point coming together, collaborating, helping you pick the next set of winners. But you're also thinking about these people's legacies and making sure they're diversified in terms of their portfolios, but diversified in what they want to make an impact on. How are you seeing that come into this moment of generative AI where everything seems to be up? We're thinking about different problems, about solving cancer, about healthcare, great leaps, changes in the way we're going to be able to make people healthier and wiser. Is generative AI something that you think about in your impact part of the business as well?
Yeah, for sure. So just taking one step back, about 5 years ago, Iconic launched Iconic Impact. And similar to how we thought the family office environment was siloed, inefficient, lonely, philanthropy's also struggled. There are, gazillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines. It's one of the great big problems we face. There are incredible organizations that have created solutions across myriad issues, but the capital isn't able to find them. It's easy to give to your alma mater, it's easy to give to your religious institution, but it's really hard to fund climate equity, really hard to fund economic mobility, racial justice, women's health, climate change, ocean health. So we created this collaborative philanthropic model where we raise these charitable funds based on issue areas. So for example, we launched the Ocean Health Collab a couple of years ago. We funded it with about $50 million from Iconic families. And we always partner with an objective independent consultant who really understands the space, in this case, ocean health. And so how is AI coming into this? Well, I'll give you one example as someone who spends a lot of time in the ocean, not as much as I would like, but as a surfer.
Got to manage some money some of the time.
Exactly. One of the organizations we funded is an organization called Coral Gardeners that is focused on really restoring reefs around the world. And what they've recently done is created Reef OS, which is using AI, embedding it in the reefs around the world, and they're testing water temperature, salinity, the number of fish. They're testing the health of the reefs. And this AI and the collection of data is working incredibly well to give them ammunition to figure out where their resources should be spent. So that's just one example of an impact story out of the Ocean Health Collab. but you can, as you said, you can see it play an important role on so many dimensions. You know, when you have climate change and you see rising seas and you can see how these storm patterns are affecting, you know, developing countries and folks that can't afford, you know, food, let alone these fisheries that are being depleted, AI is going to play a very prevalent role in helping solve some of these problems.
Only a couple of minutes left, but I'm very pleased to say audience participation is upon us. And when you're thinking about that 50 million that you get for just one particular philanthropic endeavor coming from your families, they need to have had the money from the exits. And an audience participant asks, are we going to see more exits? Are we going to see more IPOs? Or is there so much great money and capital coming from partners such as yourself that they can delay? Look at a Databricks, one of your key iconic investors. They could just keep raising money in the private market.
I think we are going to see a return to liquidity markets. I think the prediction was always sometime between 25 and 26 you would start to see these liquidity events happen. We just had Service Titan go public in December of last year. There's another number of IPOs that are slated for the next quarter. I think there was a period, 22, 23, where we had this rise in interest rates. There was a sort of a resetting, and I think we're coming out of that now. And the sense is that, you know, the next kind of quarters we'll see more liquidity events.
Will we see more coming together of sharing of generative AI ideas? I'm interested as this moment where we are upended by geopolitics, when we are trying to work out where the next value is accruing. What do you think gets us there? What do you think takes in terms of the wisdom that we need to see around corners at this moment? Yeah,
I mean, I think you are going to see greater collaboration, not just in sort of the tech evolution. You're seeing that through these open systems. I think it is important that we as a society start also collaborating and convening about thinking about these implications, both from a positive impact standpoint and how AI can drive social change in a positive way through innovation. But I also think we need to think about the secondary consequences of AI and how it's going to affect the job world, right? One of the most exciting things about AI is this notion of agents, this notion of digital employees and how we're going to be playing more of a manager role. But the implications of that down the road also have consequences. And so one of the things Iconic wants to do is spend a lot of time leveraging our convening ability to bring the right actors around the table to start thinking about how do we collaborate more? How do we think about impact at a greater scale using this amazing technology and this innovation that's coming out in real time, but making sure we're keeping an eye on the social implications as well.
Might be a few people in the audience who want to convene with you.
We would love that.
It's been a joy. We're out of time. Thank you so much for kicking off this second day of Bloomberg Invest.
Thanks, Caroline.
Wonderful conversation. Mike Anders of Iconic.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage Mark Ganzi, CEO of DigitalBridge, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Alex Steele.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Alex. How are you?
So I thought we'd start off with a super basic question. And my question was, hey, Mark, what's digital infrastructure? And I say it's super basic because I feel like we kind of know what it is, but I want to get your definition.
Well, I said, hey, Alex, it's the picks and the shovels, and it's essential plumbing to what makes AI and cloud computing and mobility work. So really, we provide the mission-critical infrastructure that enables mobile networks, really cloud computing, large enterprises, and all of the things that enable the digital economy today require that plumbing or that transport.
So if I was asking you this question 10 years ago, what would your answer be versus today?
That's a great question. I would say 10 years ago, we were pretty focused on building LTE networks and bringing that fiber connectivity to cell towers to provide the speed at which LTE was transmitting mobile data.
So it makes my phone faster.
Make your phone faster, make it more ubiquitous, and continue to provide a level of service to the customers where they could continue to proliferate their networks at that time.
And what would you say now?
I would say today we're really about enabling not only cloud and applications to the edge But I think in AI, we're really building kind of the next generation of infrastructure that'll power really compute, applications, consumer, enterprise, government agencies, machine-to-machine connectivity. The sort of paradigm shift in infrastructure today is, of course, at every iteration, it's build more, build it faster, and make it more ubiquitous. And I think that's the challenge we face today.
When Mark and I were talking offline, he was making a great comparison of the cloud and sort of the revolution in cloud and then where we are with that revolution in AI. Can you just walk me through that thinking? Because you played in the cloud, you've been doing this a long time. Where are we?
Well, I think, I like to think about these tectonic shifts in kind of 10-year iterations. I think when we started, building mobile networks in 1994, I thought that was a 10-year mission we were on. It turns out that's turned out to be a 30-year mission in building that infrastructure. When we were wiring up office buildings with high-speed internet here in New York City in 1998, 99, I thought the internet boom was a 10-year iteration. And I think as we look backwards and we look at public cloud, we started building cloud infrastructure in 2011. And ultimately those applications became commercialized in, call it 2013 to 2016, really somewhat ubiquitous on your mobile device in 2016. And that's really when the public cloud companies began to monetize cloud and applications. I really think that AI sort of follows a very similar arc in terms of where public cloud goes. We've been building AI now for about 3 years. I think we're sort of, if we were playing kind of a 9-inning baseball game, we're sort of in the second inning, maybe third inning. But keep in mind, we're still building large language models. And those data centers are big and complicated. And there's a series of host of challenges which we can talk about. And then we start moving into inference in the next 24 months. And that's where really the power of AI, like Michael said previously, gets more interesting. When you're building inference, it's a lot like the proliferation of the public cloud. And so that should be another 7 to 8 years of CapEx spending, because even today, we're still building public cloud to the edge. Edge computing is a huge part of our business today. We've got really important businesses like Atlas Edge, DataBank, and AIMS in Southeast Asia, where we're building those critical workloads in the secondary and tertiary markets that really enable compute to work at the edge.
When you mean at the edge, you mean like over there? Like
physically, right over there, the edge.
Okay,
it's
meaning
right over
that
there.
Like if I have AI on my phone, it's going to work a lot better if it's right over there.
100%. Latency is really the bottleneck in enabling compute to move quickly and to move fast and to ultimately work for that specific application or that enterprise or that government agency. So today, public cloud is on the edge. A lot of the workloads that are being built for public cloud today sit in tier 2 and tier 3 markets. So really sexy markets like Bluffdale, Utah, Overland Park, Kansas City. Woo, I know, I tell you, you're getting excited.
I'm from New York.
These secondary and tertiary markets are where those 5 megawatt and 10 megawatt leases are being signed for cloud at the edge. Inference will take a very similar blueprint and follow where public cloud went. And so this investment cycle we're in is not for the next 2 or 3 years. I tell our LPs, if you're going to invest in artificial intelligence infrastructure, be prepared to be investing for the next 10 years.
And what makes you guys really cool is you guys really build the stuff. You're not partnering, you're not taking a junior stake in another company, like you're the guys putting in the wires.
That's been our DNA. For us, it started, again, in 1994, we built our first cell towers. That was the journey for us. And today, we not only build data centers, but we build edge data centers, private cloud, public cloud, enterprise-grade data centers. And then, of course, we're building everything related to that. And that's the connectivity piece. So fiber optics are a really important part of delivering AI, and our businesses that provide that dark fiber, that conduit, and that connectivity is just as important as building the data center. And then the mobile infrastructure is growing at an incredibly fast clip as well. We're still in the early innings of building 5G. We're now kind of in the second phase of 5G infrastructure, which is what we call infill. And so as you saw probably from the earnings calls of AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, they've all upped their CapEx for 25. Why? Because now 5G is being monetized, and there's other applications that are coming. So we're really busy. I mean, mobility, cloud, connectivity, all of these things enable the economy. And so, at DigitalBridge, when we reported earnings 2 weeks ago, we actually have just recently, we're just up against about 100 billion of assets. Go back 5 years ago, we were at about 22 billion of assets under management. We've grown our business almost 5x in the last 5 years. So we've been incredibly busy, as you said, acquiring land, getting permits, getting will serve letters, dealing with supply chain issues, but really with a core focus on delivering for our customers.
You set me up for that. Did your job just get a lot harder today, considering all the tariff news and stuff?
I think, tariffs are a narrative. I don't think tariffs are a reality.
Okay.
In our industry, at least. I mean, we've built a supply chain over the last decade to prepare for ourselves and to enable what we're doing. I think a lot of our portfolio companies, we own 51 companies around the world today. A lot of our portfolio companies are very prepared. We help prepare them. A lot of the purchasing that we do, for example, at Zayo, which is the largest long-haul fiber network in the US, it's one of our companies. We started buying fiber from Corning in mass bulk 5 years ago at the beginning of COVID. So we really felt like there was this massive data tsunami coming in terms of connectivity to cloud and to AI. And so Steve Smith and I made a decision that we were going to go out and really over-purchase on Corning, and that's what we did. So we locked up a lot of fiber, and while other institutions maybe have had challenges getting fiber, we didn't. We sort of predicted the amount of data that was coming, and so we purchased in advance of that. Same thing at Vantage, our hyperscale data center operator. We developed a great partnership with Siemens 5 years ago. We knew gensets were going to be super important to enable cloud computing and AI, so we created a partnership with Siemens, and we bought a lot of gensets 5 years ago. We got out in front of that before it became a real problem. So I don't know where tariffs go yet. I think you and I were talking about it earlier. I think it's early innings in terms of what the impact will be. The only area where I see tariffs impacting sort of AI infrastructure is really in and around specialized componentry.
Okay.
And data centers do have specialized componentries that comes from places like Taiwan, Korea, Germany. These are absolute countries that are within the purview of what the president was talking about last night. So we'll have to see where the dust settles. A lot of discussion around, leveling the playing field. But I also know that this administration really appreciates the race for AI.
Right.
He's made that a priority. The president talking last night about Oracle and Masa and Sam, he gets it. I think he understands the most important part of what we're doing is we are in an arms race. And I think we want to stay out in front of that. We don't want to fall behind it. So the hope is we can have a constructive dialogue with the White House and explain as an industry why some of this specialized componentry is going to enable America to stay first.
Let's play the fun game. Let's just pretend for a second that you do get tariffs on specialized components, right?
Yes.
I'm interested in what part of your job gets harder. Does it make it more time constrained? Like, do your projects get pushed out on a time level? Do they cost more? Do the contracts that you enter in become more difficult to come to an agreement?
So I think all three things are true.
Okay.
I think first and foremost, we have delays already. Supply chain is impacting our ability to deliver, data halls on time, which allow our customers to move their servers in. There's delays with GPUs. NVIDIA is super backed up in terms of their delivery for their core customers. And so that's an issue too, that once we deliver the data hall, we turn over to hyperscaler A and we say, here you go, here's your data hall, move in. And they're like, well, we'd really like to, but we don't have the GPUs. And so I think that is an issue. I think that is a bottleneck that kind of clears itself up in 12 to 36 months, where you'll see a more normal cadence in terms of delivery. I think the other issue you talk about is just the cost side of it. Really, we felt the pain of cost in COVID. Mm-hmm. Inflation really impacted our cost of construction. So if you look at, fiber route per mile during that sort of 5-year period went up about 20%. And it wasn't Corning, it was actually the labor. So to trench a fiber route from Northern Virginia to Columbus, Ohio, which has turned out to be one of the really hot routes right now in fiber, it wasn't so much that we didn't have the cables, it was finding the right labor. And labor costs went way up because there isn't exactly a dearth of ditch diggers. So that's a specialized form of talent, specialized form of engineering, more cost. Cell towers, if you go back 5 years ago, an average cell tower would cost us on average about $190,000 to $210,000 to build. Today, an average cell tower costs somewhere between $275,000 and $325,000.
Wow.
So again, that was steel cost, specialized componentry, labor. Labor has gone way up in our industry. And then the same thing in data centers. Data center costs have moved up. We could build a megawatt 5 years ago for $7.5 to $9 million. Today, a megawatt costs between $8 and $11 million to deliver for customers. So we really felt that pain, and it was more inflationary than it is tariffs. But I think what you're seeing today is really a landscape where everything does cost more, which gets to the third point, which is the conversation with the customer. And just sitting with customers and resetting some of those relationships. And we've been doing this for 30 years. So I've had these moments where we've had to sit down with customers and say, look, this is costing us more. You know it. We know it. We're good partners. We've been partners for decades. We need more rent. And so then begins the negotiation. And so we've had constructive conversations with our customers. Look, at the end of the day, the reality is most of our customers don't want to self-perform. Their balance sheets aren't equipped to self-perform. Not everybody has the balance sheet that Microsoft or Amazon has. And so there is an admission by our customers that they want partnership, they want collaboration. So when we're sitting with Hans at Verizon, it's a great partnership. And he works with us and we work with his team, and we get to the right place. We just bought 7,000 towers from Verizon back in December. So we've had these long-lived relationships that are decades and going. And I've always told many of my, my partners that, look, the most important thing with a customer is to be transparent and be quick. Don't be slow when there's a pricing discussion to be had. If there's bad news to share it with your customer fast.
There's a question from the audience, and this talks about that edge. I want to talk more about the expansion on the edge. Is it from the core to the edge, or is there an intermediate step? And so if I understand that correctly, it means like here's where the big stuff is, and here's where the city is. And is there something in
There is actually. So the core of the network is really what they call, for example, if you're dealing with AWS or Microsoft, they'll have something that's called a primary AZ. And AZ is an availability zone, which is where they put a lot of their compute. From that AZ, you'll move out, which are in primary markets, primary markets being Santa Clara, Goodyear, Arizona, Dallas, Texas is a primary node, Atlanta, Georgia is a primary node, Northern Virginia, of course, is the biggest presence of data centers in the US, and then you kind of move out to edge. And those edge markets are the next sort of layer, which would be in Austin, Texas, it'd be a Houston, we talked about Overland Park, and so that is edge compute. And then we have something that's actually called near edge. And near edge is actually where you build these, what we call sort of RAN hubs or edge data centers like near edge. And so there what we're doing is we're taking former central offices owned by the Bell companies, or we're taking a cable head-end feed that has generators, that has power, that has fiber, but it's a smaller building. So imagine it's a building that's 5,000 to 10,000 square feet. I'm not putting 100 megawatts into that facility. I'm actually putting in anywhere from 100 kW to 250 kW, and I'm stacking anywhere from 4 to 20 racks. That's near edge. So that's literally in the suburbs. So really pushing the compute to the periphery of the network. And then ultimately we think sort of micro edge will be at the cell tower, where maybe there's a software-defined component to the radio, where you're connecting to Netflix, you're connecting to Amazon, and you're actually providing that service adjacent to the radio, which will all be software-defined. So there's actually 4 layers to where networks are going today.
I could talk to you for like 25 more minutes, but we only have 5. So I wanted to get to the liquidity issue here. So I was struck by Dawn Fitzpatrick yesterday at Soros Fund Management. She was saying that she's very hesitant for private markets because she really wants the liquidity. That's why she's staying in public markets. How do you provide liquidity when you're spending lots of money building all this stuff out?
It's an interesting conversation we have with LPs. And by the way, 100% correct. The market is in illiquids. It is by nature illiquid. And so when you're in the alternative asset management space like we are, we're in the infrastructure space. Most of our funds, Alex, are 11 to 13-year fund duration. But that being said, we have to create liquidity. This is a market where LPs demand liquidity. So the number one question that I get on the road fundraising is, how are we doing on DPI? Tell me how Fund 1 is, tell me how Fund 2 is, Fund 3, explain your vintage and explain your DPI. So we've been really focused on that. So we said on our earnings call 2 weeks ago, we've delivered about $9 billion of DPI in the last 2 years, a little over the last 2 years. And we've had 8 different exits. And the other question then we get from LPs is, well, how do you generate that liquidity? And we said, well, it's really simple. You have to be very creative. Michael mentioned before me IPOs. IPOs were really not present in the last 5 years. So we took that off the playing field. Now that's coming back into the playing field. But continuation funds have worked really well for us, where we partner with an insurance company or an allocator that really wants access to a great platform or a great product. We did that with DataBank and Swiss Life. That worked out really well. We created billions of dollars of liquidity for investors there. We've done recaps. So dividend recaps where we work with an LP that really likes an asset. So whether it's a big sovereign wealth fund or a big LP, if there's a platform inside of one of our funds that makes a lot of sense for them and they want it to be a long-term hold, we'll go and run a process, and that process will ultimately create a value, and then they'll buy 80% of that platform in demand that we stay in for 20%, and that we roll our carried interest back into the vehicle. So continuation funds, sales to other LPs, and then of course sales to other infrastructure GPs. We work with a lot of the other GPs. You know, we've sold assets to GIP, we've sold assets to KKR, we've sold assets to Antin. And so I think today in this environment, with strategics kind of being on the sidelines and IPOs being now coming back in, we've had to be a little more creative in how we structure the liquidity. But at the end of the day, DPI is DPI. So we were happy to deliver $9 billion in DPI, and it's now allowed us to go back out and ask for more capital. So we are returning capital right now. It is part of our mandate, but at the same time, we're also raising a lot of capital.
You guys also securitized fiber optic cables, right?
Yes.
I don't get that. What did that mean? How did it go?
Well, I think asset-backed securitization is really has found a nice home in digital infrastructure. I did my first cell tower securitization in 2003, and what I figured out is my background was real estate, and ultimately we had ground leases and we owned land. So we figured out that we could put mortgages on cell towers. And then what I did is by having thousands of mortgages on cell towers, I could collateralize them in a pool and I could sell them into a CMBS structure. We thought it was risky at the time. It's worked out pretty well. All three public tower companies now use CMBS as the primary mechanism to finance American Tower, Crown, and SBA. This securitization that you mentioned was our 53rd securitization that we've done as a firm. We've accessed over $30 billion of institutional capital because really institutional investors love the long-term nature of digital infrastructure. Most of our leases on a cell tower are 25 years. Our data center leases are 15 years. A long-haul fiber route IRU is 30 to 50 years. So we have really long-term visibility in our cash flows. And oh, by the way, greater than 65% of our cash flows are investment grade. So it really sets up well for either an ABS or a CMBS. Data center CMBS is where we own the land. Cell tower CMBS is where we own the land. And then ABS is on a fiber route. So think of a fiber route. If you take a long stretch of conduit from New York City all the way out to, let's go back to Northern Virginia again, Data Center Alley, and you take that fiber route, and inside that fiber route, Alex, I have 24 pairs of dark fiber. So think of that as 24 unique floors in an office building, flipped on its side. And instead of leasing to a law firm or an accounting firm, guess who you're leasing to? Google, Amazon, Microsoft. And each one of those pairs, you can sell them on that unique route because your route is super unique and it's low latency.
And I'm paying you no matter what.
And you're paying me no matter what.
Okay.
And so you're signing a 20 to 30-year contract with me. We look across the other side of the table and we see Moody's and Fitch and S&P and they're salivating. Why? Because it's investment grade and it's 30 years of cash flows. Really easy to rate a deal like that. So we decided to start securitizing Zayo's fiber routes. The deal was 28 times oversubscribed. We raised $1.4 billion in 10 days. We tightened that transaction 6 times. I've never tightened a securitization 6 times. We got it super tight and it was well executed.
Oh, perfect timing. We're over. I have like a zillion more questions, but we'll do this again. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure.
Thanks,
you.
Alex.
Please welcome to the stage Rob Barnett, Senior Energy Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you here today. Again, Rob Barnett. And I want to try to spend the next 15 minutes explaining to you why I believe energy is the pick and shovels of the AI data, or the AI gold rush. First, I'll step back for just a moment. About a year ago, I saw Sam Altman, OpenAI CEO, giving a talk, and he said a lot of provocative things, but one thing really struck me on energy. He said a breakthrough in energy was necessary to fuel the AI revolution, and he spoke fairly positively on nuclear in that context. And then maybe a few weeks later, I saw the CEO of semiconductor company ARM make a comment that data centers could consume 25% of power demand by 2030. And at this point, my BS meter was kind of going off because I've worked in energy a couple of decades. Things don't typically move that fast. And I was thinking to myself, how could the creators of ChatGPT and all of this grand things that are happening with AI, a magical question-answer machine that almost seems conscious, not get what's going on with energy? So I started to work on the problem, and my initial hypothesis was that there's no way that AI could consume as much energy as some of the folks in the business were saying. But we ultimately arrived at a conclusion that confirms some of that thinking, and I want to try to unpack our assessment of how to think about AI and energy demand. So on the screen right now, we've got two charts side by side. The one on the left shows the annual spending on generative AI that the tech team at Bloomberg Intelligence thinks is going to unfold. So the basic story there is that by 2030, this could be $1 trillion a year business. I'd seen this chart from our tech team, and I said, hey, let's take this and try to back in to what it means for power demand in the US. And we like scenarios at Bloomberg Intelligence, so we thought, okay, we know that the tech industry evolves rapidly, and so let's think about a world where AI takes off, but we get more efficient chips, more efficient algorithms. That's your bottom line, the one in green. Or maybe we don't get as big of efficiency breakthroughs as folks would hope, and we get a lot of consumption and usage of these AI data tools. So that's the top line in blue. And so basically the top line shows you that AI data centers could consume about 19% of US power demand in 2030. Bottom line's closer to 8% in 2030. In either case, it's pretty substantial growth, but it's certainly a big window to think about. So let me illuminate that point a little bit further. So this is zooming in on that chart that was on the right there. You've probably heard about Stargate. Stargate is the OpenAI initiative. You saw Sam Altman, Oracle CEO, SoftBank CEO, up with President Trump earlier this year talking about it. It's a $500 billion data center initiative. And if you think about $500 billion being spent on data centers, well, how much power demand would that consume? A good rule of thumb today, at least, is that a data center, for every $1 billion in CapEx that you do on a data center, it translates into about 0.4 terawatt hours of power demand. So if the 500 billion Stargate initiative gets built, that effectively would double power demand from data centers in the US from one, albeit large, project. And so I think we've got a cool tool that we did as part of our analysis where you can go and sort of look under the hood, play with our assumptions if you'd like. We also approached this problem from a bottom-up perspective and said, look, well, how much energy does each GPU that NVIDIA is going to sell consume, and how many GPUs are they going to sell this year, next year, based on consensus? And you get very similar numbers. So I think my initial skepticism, or if you're skeptical of the energy component of this, I believe it's real, and we've got some cool tools and data to help you sort of confirm thinking around that. Now, there's a couple other trends that maybe I'll just mention quickly. The first one is that electricity demand is growing for a couple of other reasons in the US. One is manufacturing. So, and my slide's not advancing. I'm not one to dwell on slides, but if we could go to the next slide. So, 20% this is the amount of manufacturing spending that has unfolded in the U.S. over the last 25 years. And you've seen a real surge in manufacturing, partly because of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, partly because of the CHIPS Act. By the way, this is not intended to be a sort of politically focused conversation, but we actually think the CHIPS Act and many components of the IRA are going to survive the current political environment. Happy to follow up with any of you if you want to chat about that. But this is another factor that's helping to drive up electricity demand. Electric vehicles would be another component. So you've got three pillars of strong electricity demand growth. You've got AI data centers, resurgence of manufacturing in the US, and vehicle electrification. And then you sort of have to say, okay, well, if power demand is going to grow, what kind of electrons are going to meet that power demand? The general view from us, at least, is that we're going to see some combination of solar, battery storage, and natural gas are going to be the big winners of this increase in power demand that could unfold over the next 5 years. A very interesting chart up on the screen right now. This is the assessment of all projects out in the US that have requested to be connected to the grid. And there's over a terawatt of solar projects, about half of them have storage coupled as well, that have said they want to be added to the US power system. For context, the US power grid has 1.25 terawatts installed today. So basically there's enough solar capacity that's been proposed out there to essentially double US power capacity. The next biggest component of projects that folks are building is storage, then wind, and then gas and other comes down the line. So solar really is the type of technology that is moving very quickly in the US right now. And there's a lot of reasons why that's true. One is simply because you can build solar very quickly. And speed is particularly important to the folks trying to build data centers. The hyperscalers aren't looking to get their data centers built in 2035 or 2030. They want them built as quickly as possible. Solar is the technology that can move most quickly. If you follow GE Vernova, they make gas turbines. I think they've got a 5-year backlog. So, if you want a new gas turbine, sure, you can make an order today, but it's going to take time to get that equipment. So we think this is an opportunity for a lot of the US listed solar companies. Just up here on the screen right now, context, they had a pretty rough 2024, despite all of the cheerleading and optimism from the President Biden and his team. 2024 wasn't a good year. If you want the history lesson on what happened there, please do follow up. But this year looks like a turnaround story. Next year is probably a continuation of that turnaround story. And what's driving that turnaround, AI data centers, is probably a big component of that. And we think it probably gives upside to consensus in terms of sales for companies like First Solar and others that are geared to this thesis. I mentioned gas as well. So we all know that solar is not available at night. I feel like I occasionally need to point that out to satisfy the folks who regularly like to point it out to me, but it pairs well with storage. It also pairs well with natural gas. And so we do think gas is a big part of the AI energy story. Gas could increase anywhere from 3 to 10 BCF per day by 2030, based on our analysis of the AI data center piece. So this is not LNG. This is not any of the other things that are sort of out there driving some of that fundamental gas demand. 3 to 10 BCF per day potentially comes from data centers alone by 2030. It's a pretty big number if you don't think about gas markets very much. And I want to also hit on the idea of nuclear as part of this, because, as I mentioned, Sam Altman and many of the others speak very favorably of nuclear in the U.S. So chart on the screen, just giving you some context here. The blue line is monthly generation from wind and solar combined. Nice upward moving trajectory. Nuclear, pretty stable through time, and this chart goes back 25 years. The interesting thing about nuclear in this context is you've seen some pretty big headlines. You saw Microsoft announce a deal with Constellation regarding 3 Mile Island and restarting that facility. Amazon reached an agreement with Talon Energy and their Susquehanna nuclear station. And so you are seeing nuclear really enter the verbiage of the hyperscalers. They are interested in doing that. But the only issue is that beyond the, restarting maybe a couple idled reactors, buying some capacity from reactors that are already in place, the difficulty with nuclear is that it is a technology that you have to think about in terms of decades or longer. Many of the hyperscalers have investments or agreements related to things like small modular reactors, SMRs, maybe even fusion is being worked on. But we think that in the 2030 timeline, probably very little chance any of that nuclear capacity is online. 2035, 2040, sure, why not? Lots can get done over a kind of 15-year time horizon, but we definitely don't see it in the near term. So that brings us back to, okay, so if you got rapidly rising power demand in the US, how are you going to fill it? You're going to do some combination of solar plus storage plus natural gas. Wind will also be in the mix, although if you're following the current administration, wind is not as popular of a technology here at the moment. So with that, I will just briefly conclude with, there's a QR code up on the screen. If you scan it, you can go download a deep dive report that we've got on this topic if you want to go deeper into the ins and outs of this particular thesis. My contact information and everything is also available there. And so with that, I'm going to conclude here, and I want to thank our title sponsor for today's event, which is Invesco QQQ, for supporting this innovation stage. And I just want to reiterate that we're just getting started today, and Bloomberg Invest is continuing upstairs, so please make your way there now.
so seriously. Look at you all dressed up for someone you never see. You're here for a reason, but you don't know why. You're split and uneven, your hands to the sky. Surrender yourself. And I wonder why I tear myself down to be built back up again. Oh, I hope somehow I'll wake up young again. All that's left of myself, holes in my false confidence. And now I lay myself down and hope I wake up young again. Hope I wake up young again. Don't let those demons in again. I filled the void up with polished out fake sentiment. Surrender yourself. And I wonder why I tear myself down to be built back up again. Oh, I hope somehow I'll wake up young again. All that's left of myself, holes in my...
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes.
Hope I wake up young again. Hope I wake up young again. Hope I wake up young again. Why won't you take me seriously? Look at me all up for someone I'll never meet. And I wonder why I tear myself down to be built back up again. Oh, I hope somehow I'll wake up young again. All that's left of myself, holes in my false confidence. And now I lay myself down and hope I wake up. Wonder why I tear myself down to be built back up again. Oh, I hope somehow I'll wake up young again. All that's left of myself, holes in my false confidence. And now I lay myself down and hope I wake up young again. Hope I wake up young again. Hope I wake up young again. Don't
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Global trade disruptions, inflationary pressures, the race for artificial intelligence supremacy.
DeepSeek really rattling, it feels like, every part of that supply chain.
And what an unpredictable Trump administration could bring next.
The golden age of America has officially begun.
Investors right now face uncertainty at home and abroad. From Wall Street to Main Street, every move counts. We'll look across public and private assets, crypto and wealth management, deal making and capital demands, and where the risks and opportunities lie. Bloomberg is here to track, dissect, and navigate the markets alongside the industry's most influential voices. Welcome to Bloomberg Invest.
Please welcome to the stage Sonali Basak, anchor and global finance correspondent for Bloomberg.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back for day two. How much changes in just 24 hours? We're thrilled to have you here today in New York City, and we also welcome those tuning in across the globe. It's been an amazing event so far. We have heard from Harvey Schwartz, the CEO of Carlyle, Nir Bardea, the CEO of Bridgewater, and of course, former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin. And today we're going to continue with more of the biggest names across banking, asset management, wealth, deals, and private markets. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our title sponsor, Invesco QQQ, our presenting sponsor, MassMutual, and our supporting sponsor, TIAA. Now, this event works best if you participate, so take out your phones, please. First, put it on silent, and then scan this QR code. This is going to be very handy. It's going to give you everything you're going to need today. On the landing page, you're going to find our agenda. It will prompt you to download our event app, and there you can subscribe to sessions, get notifications, take part in digital networking where you can message fellow attendees to set up meetings, and there you can type in a special code to access that. On this page, you can find what I always find most important, the Wi-Fi information, and there's a tab where you can click to submit questions to our speakers on stage. Please do. I promise we'll try to do our best to get to them. And additionally, if you don't already subscribe to Bloomberg News and all of our global coverage, 2,700 journalists around the globe, today is your lucky day because you can click to enjoy both individual and group discounts. If you're enjoying the event, you have your own thoughts or just want to spread the word on social media where you can find me a lot, you can follow along with our coverage under the hashtag Bloomberg Invest. You can also tag us in your posts at Bloomberg Live. Now, Before any ado, we can get started. Welcome to the stage. I'm so excited for this particular conversation. Stephen Mnuchin, founder and partner of Liberty Strategic Capital, of course, also former Treasury Secretary, alongside Carlyle co-founder David Rubenstein, for a live recording of the peer-to-peer conversation.
Hey, Steve, thanks very much for coming.
Good to see you. It's always good to be with you.
So you served as the 77th Secretary of the Treasury. When President Trump was reelected, did you say, maybe I want to go back in again, or you had enough government service?
Well, it was an extraordinary experience working for him and being part of the whole first campaign. And now I'm really focused on private investments and opportunities, but I am trying to help from the outside.
Okay, so you're not going to go back in anytime soon?
I'm happy doing what I'm doing and giving a little coaching from the outside to whoever needs it.
You know, you served for 4 years, and President Trump, to my knowledge, never criticized you in public. I don't know about private, but, you know, so to be 4 years and never be criticized in public, that was pretty impressive. So what's the secret? Have you told the new Secretary of Treasury what to do?
I haven't told him what to do. I think he's in very good shape. Look, I understood the president's agenda. I had the opportunity to help shape the economic agenda, and we were proud of what we did the first term. We were focused on tax cuts, getting the biggest tax cuts done, trade, and regulatory relief, and I'm excited to see them focused on it again.
So how do you think the tariffs are going to affect the economy? Why does President Trump like tariffs so much?
Well, the president's been very focused on tariffs for a long time. And he fundamentally believes it's a good source of revenue and that it's impactful in getting people to change behavior. And that's what we're seeing today.
Okay. All right. So you think that tariffs will be ultimately good for the U.S. economy, I assume? You have a similar view?
Well, I think the market really wants certainty and understanding certainty and will adjust to whatever they are. I think the problem right now is we don't have certainty. My own view on the tariffs would be that if he wants to do something, I like the idea of the 10% tariff across the board. It's a consumption tax on foreign goods. But if he were to do that, he should do that through the reconciliation process, so that can be scored. I think would raise about $2.5 trillion and could be used to pay for tax cuts, as an example.
Speaking of tax cuts, you engineered with President Trump the very large tax cut of his first term. Do you think a similar sized tax cut is essential now?
Well, the biggest focus for them is just extending the personal side of the tax cuts, which are going to expire. And I think that, you know, that was a signature part of his first term. And I think that's got to be the priority to continue. Now, on top of that, I know he wants to do additional tax cuts, and that'll be a little bit more challenging with the pay-fors.
During the campaign, he talked about a couple other tax cuts. One is no tax on tips. Are people getting tips actually paying a lot of taxes? I don't know. I mean, the cash they're getting, I don't know how much they're paying, and maybe they're paying a lot of tax. Is that a big source of revenue or loss of revenue if you don't have tax on tips?
Well, you know, we're not in as much as a cash society as we used to, so there's a lot of tips that go through an electronic mechanism. I think if he wants to have a small carve-out for tax on tips, I think that makes sense. I think, obviously, if you start giving tips to investment bankers at the end of the year instead of bonuses and they don't get taxed, that would be a little bit more problematic. And, you know, you could tax your lawyers so I think if he does that, it needs to have a small carve-out.
In the campaign, he also talked about, I think, no tax on Social Security. Wouldn't that be pretty expensive?
Very expensive.
And no tax on overtime, too, I think he talked about. Does that be expensive, too?
It would be.
Okay, so when you were working on the tax cut, when you were Secretary of Treasury, how did you find the intellectual level of the Ways and Means Committee members? Were they really able to understand everything you guys wanted to do? And how was it like to engage with the Ways and Means Committee?
Well, I mean, there's no question, you know, when we passed the tax cuts, and this was a lot of work, we were very engaged with both the House and Senate. And actually, we had weekly meetings, which was called the Big Six. It was me and Gary Cohn from the White House. It was the Senate, and it was the House. And literally every week we sat down and went through details. So, I mean, as you know, I mean, we had sweeping tax reform across everything. This time it is actually a lot simpler, but I do think Secretary Bessent needs to be very focused on working with the House and the Senate to get this across the finish line.
Okay, so in recent decades, the annual deficit has been fairly high. I think under President Trump's first 4 years, I don't know exactly, I think it was maybe $6 to $8 trillion of additional debt added to the total debt. We have that $36 trillion now. How are we going to get the debt down and the deficit down if we have these big tax cuts?
Well, David, let me just say, I think the deficit is probably the most important issue today in terms of the long-term impact on the economy. And just to put this in perspective, in the first term, we had debt to GDP ratio of about 100%. And with the tax cuts and economic growth before COVID, we were growing the economy faster than we were growing the debt. So that ratio would have come down. And I think we were trying to get it down to 90 to 95. The big focus on the first term was military spending. We unfortunately had to increase non-military spending to get it through the House and Senate. But what really impacted us was COVID. And I think, as you know, firsthand, we had to spend a lot of money in COVID or we would have had a worldwide depression, not recession. I think the problem was, the first $2 trillion was well spent. The next $2 trillion we never should have spent. And then the Biden administration kept on spending. So, we have debt to GDP of close to 125% today. That's a gigantic problem. Secretary Bessent has talked about getting the deficit down from 6% to 3% of GDP. And that's got to be a major focus. So if we're going to do the tax cuts, we need to make sure there's pay-fors and we need to make sure there's economic growth.
When Bob Rubin was Secretary of the Treasury, he once talked about the value of the dollar, and he made a mistake, he later would say, by talking about saying something other than we want a strong dollar. And now every Treasury Secretary is told you can only say one thing about the dollar, we want a strong dollar. But what can former Secretaries of Treasury say about that? Can they say we want a strong dollar, or can you say maybe it should weaken a little bit and to make our exports easier to sell?
Well, it's funny that you say that. And Bob really was kind of credited with the strong dollar policy. And I think it's kind of every Treasury Secretary after that kind of, you got Treasury 101 training. And the first thing they told you was just talk about a strong dollar. Actually, when I was at Davos, I made a comment that I commented on a balanced, stable dollar as opposed to saying a strong dollar. And all of a sudden, the dollar moved significantly. Look, I think, and now I can talk a little bit more freely about this, but I think on the long term, it is important that we have a strong dollar. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and a strong dollar reflects a strong economy. Right. In the short term, particularly because of trade, the strength of the dollar can have a negative impact. But I think the most important thing is actually a stable dollar so that there's not volatility.
Speaking of stable, what do you think about the Secretary of Treasury or the U.S. government supporting cryptocurrencies? They didn't really have them so much when you were Secretary of Treasury, but now cryptocurrencies seem to be very heavily supported by President Trump and his administration. Do you have any comment on whether that's a good or bad thing?
Look, my view on crypto has been pretty consistent. We did a lot of work on this in the first term. If people want to buy crypto as an asset class, like they buy gold, that's fine. I personally wouldn't invest in it, but that's fine. To me, the bigger issue has been making sure that crypto is not used for illicit activities. And, we spent a long time getting rid of Swiss numbered banking accounts, making sure that we have a mechanism that crypto can be compliant with BSA and all of our money laundering regulations. And I have concerns today about that.
In the business world, investment world, if you hire more fundraisers, you usually raise more money. In the IRS world, if you get more agents, you usually raise more money. But for some reason, the Republican Party seems to want to have fewer agents, and therefore they reduce the number of agents, and therefore maybe they're not going to raise as much money. Do you have a view on whether cutting back the IRS agents that were put in under President Biden is a good thing to do or not?
Well, I have a strong view on this. I spent a lot of time overseeing the IRS. I mean, the reason why Biden administration added so many agents, this is the silly part of government math. So if they added all these agents, they were able to score it that they were going to able to raise revenue in the future, and they spent that revenue today. So I actually don't think we need more agents. What we need is a bigger investment in technology in the IRS. The systems are outdated. And I think in this day and age, there's a lot we can do with technology that we don't need physical agents auditing people. It can be done electronically.
Now, is it possible for the Doge people to get the individual tax returns of a particular person who they might not like, or that's pretty impossible to do?
Well, it's not allowed. So people are not allowed to get individual taxpayer information. My understanding is that they can get access to anonymized information. Again, I think it would be helpful for Doge to help look at modernizing the technology, but obviously, looking at specific taxpayer information should not be allowed and isn't allowed.
Okay. Now, President Trump and his administration are very focused on the trade deficit, which is very, very high these days. But is the trade deficit that big a problem compared to the budget deficit? If you were to worry about which deficit, wouldn't budget deficit be more important than the trade deficit?
Well, as you said, we have what's called the twin deficits. Right. In my opinion, the budget deficit at $2 trillion annually is a much bigger problem. And I think, by the way, if you brought down the budget deficit, by definition, you'd bring down the trade deficit because you'd have less demand for goods in general. And I do think the idea of resetting trade relationships, President Trump is right that the U.S. market has been open for foreign trade, and foreign markets have not been open in the same way. We spent a lot of time with China on the phase one deal. They haven't lived up to that. But the whole idea was, if we could allow access, our business, to a growing China middle class, that's an enormous opportunity for U.S. business. And I do think kind of a big part of the trade deficit is we don't have fair trade in both directions.
Now, President Trump has made a big push on getting American companies and foreign companies to invest in the United States, manufacture things. That would probably be somewhat inflationary because, by definition, if you have people producing things overseas, probably because it's the lowest cost producer, if you bring them back to the United States with higher labor costs, it'll be a higher cost production, and therefore maybe more inflationary. Despite that, you think it's a good idea to have more things manufactured in the United States?
Well, I definitely think U.S. manufacturing jobs has always been a big focus of his. I think, there was a large part of the economy that was left behind. And I do think that's a focus. Now, obviously, there are different markets that can be competitive. So I think we can have the same thing. But his focus should be U.S. investment.
So when you became the Secretary of the Treasury, there was somebody on the Federal Reserve Board who had been appointed by President Obama, James J. Powell, who used to work at my firm. And then you recommended him to President Trump, I think, to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve. President Trump was not happy with him at the beginning, I guess, but I think he's going to keep him now, I guess. Any regrets about recommending Jay Powell, and what kind of job do you think he's done?
Well, let me first say, despite the fact that Obama did appoint him, Jay was a Republican and is a Republican. I had the opportunity to work with him really on a lot of the regulatory issues at first when Janet Yellen was chair. And I do think Jay's done a very good job. As President Trump, he had a bunch of issues with him raising rates. But then during COVID, he did give him the Most Improved Player award when he dropped rates down to zero at the time.
So generally, the President of the United States is not supposed to talk to or lobby the chairman of the Fed, but the Secretary of Treasury usually meets regularly with the chairman of the Fed to kind of talk about things to some extent. Did you meet with him fairly regularly, and how did those conversations go when you met with Jay Powell?
I did. We inherited a tradition which has been kept up, is that the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Fed meet weekly. It alternates every week between being at the Treasury and the Fed. And I found those meetings very helpful. A big focus was obviously what we were doing on regulation. Monetary policy. I never talked about monetary policy publicly. But yes, of course, we did talk about those types of things. We talked about the economy, and I think we had a very good working relationship.
So today, if you were Jay Powell, would you lower interest rates in the next 6 months or so?
I think it's pretty clear the Fed is going to lower rates. So, I mean, if you look at the dot plot, which is, what the Fed governors have publicly said, you do see rates coming down to about 3.25, and you see the long-term rate at about 2.8. I do think the long-term rate between being closer to 2.5 than 3, and I think we're going to see rates lowered next year. And by the way, I think the 10-year has that already built in to the market. So I think we're going to see 3.25, 3.5% funds, and I think we'll see about 4% 10-year treasuries.
So if President Trump were to call you and say, I need to have a new chairman of the Fed in May of 26, who would you recommend?
Well, I have a bunch of ideas, but I'm not going to say that publicly. I would say that privately to him.
Okay. So let's go to the next subject then. More important than the policy of the economic policy of the United States government is a subject called private equity. So you left Secretary of Treasury and you started a private equity firm, Liberty Strategic Capital. So is private equity as fulfilling as you thought? I know you were in it a bit before you became Secretary of Treasury, but how do you enjoy the private equity world?
Well, David, I've been in the investment business and the markets businesses now for 40 years. And I think kind of every job I did kind of prepared me more for the future. And when I became Treasury Secretary, I think it was helpful that I had a background in markets and risk. I had a background, I had been CEO of a bank, so that, I understood a lot of these issues. We're small enough that we focus on a handful of investments. We've done about 10 investments to date. And, I find it very interesting.
Okay. You agree with my view that the highest calling of mankind is private equity?
I do not.
No, you don't think so? There's something more important? Well, I don't know what it is, but okay.
I would have thought you were going to tell me the highest calling was to own a baseball team.
If it's a winning team, yes. But so let me ask you, when you're Secretary of Treasury, and you're a very powerful person, and then when you're on the private sector, you're going and asking people for money who used to ask you for, information about what's going on. What is it like to kind of make that switch to kind of asking people for money who used to ask you for not favors but more information or help? Hard?
Well, no. I mean, first of all, fortunately, we're not in the fundraising business, and
you raised for your first fund about $4 billion plus or something.
Well, I can't comment on the size of it and things like that. But yes, we did raise our fund. But what I find interesting now is actually it's when you're Treasury Secretary, and it's an extraordinary experience, but you can't publicly talk about a lot of things, and there's limitations on what you can do. So I find it actually quite interesting being involved in different things now from the outside.
Well, one of the pleasures of being Secretary of the Treasury is you get your handwriting on the dollar bill, something like that. So some Secretary of Treasuries had incomprehensible, indecipherable handwritings, and you couldn't figure out who actually was signing it. But what was the pleasure like of getting bills, $100 bills or dollar bills, and having your signature on it? Was that fun or not?
Well, David, I changed my signature because my signature was completely illegible. Okay. Oh. And I thought if I'm going to have my signature on the money forever, it would be nice if you could see it and read it. So I simplified my signature a lot. I guess the question is I wonder if President Trump wants his signature on the money.
By the way, I have a similar problem. I can't do cursive because I think that was being taught in the second grade when it was Jewish holidays, and I wasn't in school, so I can't really write cursive, so I don't have to worry about this. I'm not going to be Secretary of Treasury. But there is a proposal now to have a $250 bill, a bill has been proposed in Congress with President Trump's picture on it. Usually, you're supposed to have passed away before you get your picture on it, but do you have any comment on that? Or?
Well, my only comment is, why would he pick 250? Let's go for 1,000 if they're going to pass the law.
Okay. Well, when you were Treasury Secretary, you did work on, I think, having a woman on the dollar bill. Was it the $20 bill or something? It was going to be somebody, but it took years to get it done. It hasn't happened yet. Do you actually think there will be a woman on the dollar bill in our lifetime?
Well, David, what I was focused on, and I knew it wasn't going to be my decision. It was going to pass over. I don't know if it'll be Scott Bessent's or not. But what we were very focused on the time is the issue around the dollar and so that you couldn't replicate it and the security features of the dollar. And there are changes that I can't talk about that are in the works around the printing. So that takes time, and that's the most important part of the change.
Now, one of the most important parts of the Treasury code, IRS code, is something called carried interest taxation. You're probably familiar with that.
I've heard about it a few times.
times.
I heard about it during the first
I know. I talked to you about it maybe a few times. I don't remember exactly. But President Trump has never been a big fan of that, I think you know. And I think in this current speeches he's made about it, he said he wanted to get rid of current carried interest taxation and whatever benefit sports owners gets as well. I don't know exactly what they are. But so do you have a view on carried interest now that you were in the private equity world? Do you think we should preserve it or not preserve it, or you don't want to comment on it?
Well, David, there's going to be a lot of pay-fors have to be in the tax code, and they're going to look at a lot of different things. I will say, first of all, on the carried interest, it doesn't raise a lot of revenue. I mean, look, one of the issues, as you know, on carried interest is if you have two investors, and we invested, you know, if I invested 50% and you invested 50%, we'd each pay a certain amount of tax. To the extent you create a fund and we decide, as opposed to it being 50-50, we're going to exchange profits, it doesn't change the tax that the government collects. So I think from an academic standpoint, you know, there's a reason behind this. From a revenue standpoint, that'll have to be something that Congress looks at.
So what is the biggest pleasure you've gotten out of having a private equity fund now? You raised the fund, you've made a number of investments. Are you enjoying this as much as being Secretary of Treasury or being a partner at Goldman Sachs, or not as much?
I mean, David, all these experiences were really extraordinary. I mean, what I find interesting about this is investing in businesses and being able to impact certain businesses. You know, I've had a long experience in banking. We made a big investment that we bailed out and saved what was Flagstar Bank. It was called New York Community Bank at the time. Yes. And, you know, banking is something that's been very interesting to me. So this is the second time I did this. During the financial crisis, we bought several banks from the FDIC, IndyMac Bank.
Okay, so what are the areas you're focused on? Is it financial services, cyber? What are the areas?
Technology and financial services are our two major focus.
Okay, and entertainment, you did a lot of that before you were Secretary of Treasury. You're doing any of those kind of investments?
We do a little bit of it. I mean, we've been, you know, big investors over time in content. When I was investing in movies, it was more actually a technology play and understanding bandwidth to the home and the demand for content.
Okay, so today, when people invest in private equity, the kind of rates of return they expect are probably lower than they were 20 years ago when more leverage was used and a whole variety of other things. But do you think somebody investing in private equity today with a reputable firm should get a rate of return in the low to mid-teens, something like that?
A little bit higher.
Higher than that?
Yes.
With you higher than that?
Well, I can't comment on me, but I'd say, I would say industry
mid to
returns.
higher teens?
Yes.
Okay. And today, in your view, is Congress likely to deal with the budget deficit in a way where we won't have to deal with the government shutting down? Do you think that's a real risk that the government could shut down again?
Look, I'd say, you know, there's two issues that, again, that I spent a lot of time on, both the debt ceiling and government funding. And, you know, the issue here, and, you know, the government, so as Treasury, we could have the money and not be able to spend it because of government funding. Or we could have the government funding but not have enough money because of the debt ceiling. My major focus was the debt ceiling. And one of the things I think now is the most important issue is the Republicans need to get the debt ceiling into a reconciliation bill quickly and raise the debt ceiling.
In 1917, the debt ceiling was first imposed, and we've now raised it more than 90 times. President Trump has said before we should get rid of the debt ceiling. And we're the only country in the world with one other than Denmark. So what is your view on, do we need a debt ceiling because we change it all the time anyway, or should we just keep the debt ceiling?
Well, given the side of the debt that we have today and the focus on the debt, I would keep the debt ceiling. I think it's an important mechanism. It's become too political, but I think spending and the debt ceiling should be passed at the same time. So whenever Congress passes whatever the spending is, they should simultaneously pass the debt ceiling so that you can afford to pay for that. But I don't think, unlimited spending is a good thing. As I mentioned earlier, COVID, we had to do $1 trillion spending. We then got spending out of control, and we need to get that back into control.
Now, many countries around the world have something called a sovereign wealth fund, and the United States doesn't have that. We have the printing press. We print dollars, and people buy those dollars, but we don't have a sovereign wealth fund. President Trump has signed an executive order, I think, creating a sovereign wealth fund. But where will the money come from for that sovereign wealth fund?
Well, David, as you know, most countries that have sovereign wealth funds are because they have certain resources today that are going to be limited. Right. Obviously, oil and energy is a big focus. And the purpose of the sovereign wealth fund is to capture a huge amount of those revenues today so that it can be spent over generations. The U.S. is not in that situation. So if we're going to have a sovereign wealth fund, I think obviously we'd have to borrow to put the money in the sovereign wealth fund since we don't have a surplus. And if we did that, I think it should be very limited in scope for, are there certain areas that we need government support? It shouldn't be used, obviously, to crowd out private investments.
The third rail of American politics is thought to be the Social Security system and Medicare. Some people say ultimately we are running out of money to fund the Social Security system because people are living longer and so forth, and we have more people retiring and then living longer. Are you worried about the security of the Social Security system?
David, one of the big titles I had in government was managing trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund.
Okay.
And, when I got there, I thought I actually could do a lot of good. And one of the things I was actually very focused on, Social Security still has paper cards. And I thought one of the most ridiculous things is the Social Security number is the identifier most people use. I wanted to focus on creating electronic ID, and I think that's still something we should do. Now, as it relates to the trust fund, we'd issue a report every year. The trust fund is going to run out of money, and I think it's something that Congress has to deal with. I hope that in the second half of the president's term, he can focus on Social Security reform, because it's a problem. The fund is going to run out of money, and there's lots of people who rely upon it, so it needs to be fixed.
In the second half of this term, he might have a different House of Representatives. Historically, the first midterm election, a president usually loses about 25 seats in the House. There's no evidence that what will happen now, but if President Trump were to lose control of the House, do you think that would affect his agenda a great deal in terms of Social Security reform, other things, and therefore he needs to get everything done in the first 2 years that he really wants to get done?
Well, first of all, as you know, the House, we have a very small majority in the House. Right. So, yes, I do think for the first 2 years, he has to focus on what are the most important legislative agendas. Obviously, border security is something he's very focused on. I know there's been this talk of one bill or two bills. Personally, I would do two bills. I think he can have a very quick win on border security and get that done through reconciliation. Tax reform is more complicated, so I think that's going to take a good part of the year. He could get the debt ceiling into the first bill. He can then get all his taxes done in the second bill. I think on something like Social Security, you're going to need bipartisan support. You're not going to want to attack that now. That's something, so it doesn't matter who controls Congress for that.
Bismarck, I think it said that there's two things you don't want to see being made are sausage and legislation. And what is it like when you're doing tax bills? You're sitting in a smoke-filled room, and you're sitting there with the members of Congress, and they saying, I'll give you this, and you give me this. And how does that really work? Are there trade-offs, or everybody says we just have to do what's best for the American people, and we're not going to do any trade-offs or deals?
Well, first of all, there were no smoke-filled rooms. That may have happened in the past, but at least when I was there, nobody was smoking. No, I think that, and as I said, we worked very closely with the House and Senate. These are huge, complicated issues. Of course, there have to be trade-offs. You have to think of how there were pay-fors. I mean, when we did this the first time, it was $1.5 trillion static. trillion dynamic, and we had about $500 billion in what we considered to be baseline issues. So of course there have to be trade-offs. And then I would just comment on, even when tax reform was passed, we spent the next year writing tax regulations in Treasury, which is a very important function to institute the law.
So if you were king for a day and you can make any change in the way the economy, the finance structure of the United States is based, the spending is done, what would be the one thing that you think we should do to make our economy better or make our financial system better than it is today? One thing.
I would reform the spending process and the debt ceiling process so that there was a real process of the administration having a budget, that budget going through Congress every year, and that kind of the focus around spending.
Okay, so for the time being, you're going to be in the private sector. You're not going to be drafted back into government, and you're happy with the highest calling of mankind that you're now pursuing, private equity, right?
The highest calling was serving the people in the government. I know you think this is the highest.
Okay.
And David, I know you've been terrific in advising and helping presidents, and I'm sure you'll also give President Trump a bunch of advice.
Well, I don't know if he needs my advice. Certainly not on the Kennedy Center, probably, but we'll see. Okay. Okay, I think we're out of time. So we're out of time? Right. Okay. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm David Rubenstein. For nearly a decade, I've interviewed some of the most interesting and powerful people in the world. Presidents, athletes, CEOs, entrepreneurs. I talk to them about their careers and their lives. Inevitably, we almost always end up talking about how they're living and how much they think about trying to live better. We're all trying to make sense of the mountain of new information available and the ambitious efforts underway to tackle the biggest health obstacles. For longevity, come with me as I talk with the leading experts in science and medicine and ask them the questions we all have: how to be healthier and ultimately how to live longer.
Please welcome to the stage Tashonda Brown Duckett, President and CEO of TIAA, for a live recording of The Big Take with Bloomberg's David Gura.
Thank you for being here, and I would acknowledge the support of TIA for this event as well on behalf of my colleagues. And my hope is we can talk a bit about the retirement crisis. I know there's a tendency to despair when you're talking about a crisis, so talk about some solutions to that, potential solutions to, and then kind of end talking about the economy and this moment. Reading up on this, reading into this, the statistics are so staggering. Torsten Slok, an economist at Apollo, had a note this week. He said 50%, almost 50% of Americans have nothing saved for retirement. So let's start, if we could, just by talking about the contours of this crisis the country is facing, how sobering it is when you look at it headlong.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. We do have a retirement challenge in our country, and to set the frame, and then I'll offer some solutions. We know that today 40% of all Americans run the risk of running out of money. We know that women retire with 30% less, but live longer. And we also know, when you look at diverse communities, the stats are even more staggering. We know that today 11,000 people are hitting the retirement age every single day, and that will continue. And that's on a backdrop of a $4 trillion savings gap. And so when we think about the problem, I would frame it in three ways. First, we have a savings gap. We know that Americans are not saving enough. And you even mentioned, as you even think about just everyday savings, most people run out of money for basic needs. So we have to address the savings gap. What that means is that for employers, there's a tremendous opportunity to make sure that you're auto-enrolling everyone, that everyone in the workplace starts with that retirement plan. And we would suggest auto-escalation, so that if you started enrolling and you could not provide the maximum amount of your benefit, but every year you just increase a little. Within that, you have the ability to opt out if there is an issue, but the most important thing is the next year we will opt you in. The biggest risk when I think about having people opt in and opt out and not be able to go back in is that one emergency moment where you may have had to reduce your contribution. If you don't opt back in, or you don't have a system that makes it easier for you to opt in, that one situation in life could then result in 20 years of losing compounding interest, 20 years of not being able to accumulate, and that one moment actually has real ramifications when you're ready to retire. So for savings, we need to make sure that people are saving, but they're saving enough. Secondly, there's an access gap. We know that 57 million Americans do not have access to a workplace retirement plan. And so it's very important that we work with respect to good policy to make it easier for small businesses to be able to offer retirement vehicles without it being a burden, without it being complicated, so that people can get on a path to a secure retirement. And lastly, we have a guarantee gap. You know, we know that Social Security is not sufficient. Social Security was never designed to be 100% replacement of income. We know that in the 70s, when inflation was high, we had pensions. Pensions was about 70%. And so Americans had access to a pension, and they had access to Social Security, and they had access to their overall saving vehicles. Today, that number is 12%. And so when you think about 12% pensions, when you think about Social Security not being sufficient, we have a guarantee gap. And so we believe at TIAA that it's really important to have insurance as part of the allocation. That's a nod to our heritage and what we've been doing to serve people like your dad over the years. What does that mean and why? With having insurance within a retirement plan, you have exposure to equity so that you can get the alpha. You have exposure to bonds. But what insurance will provide is it will protect you with respect to longevity risk. People are living longer, and you cannot know the magic number on when you will leave this world. So having confidence that your income will be there is important. Secondly, it addresses the market volatility. It gives you that safety net. So regardless of what's happening in the market, you can count on it, and you don't have to maybe take out some equity exposure at the wrong time in order to give you income. The bottom line between access gap, savings gap, and guarantee gap, the punchline for retirement is that income has to be the outcome. Social Security is not enough. We have to work together in both a private and public way to make sure that we can design great policy, to make sure that the private sector is doing our part, educating our employee base so that people can feel confident in the accumulating years, but as importantly, when they're ready to decum, they can be sure that their retirement will be there and that they won't outlive it.
I want to ask you about young people in particular. Yeah. So we're at a moment where so much of what was attainable or seemed attainable doesn't seem that way right now. So it's hard to look far into the future when you look at the cost of college and it's so expensive. Buying a house seems more difficult than it has in the past. How do you message to or convince young people that they need to think beyond those things when there is such difficulty really kind of getting those things in the more immediate future?
No, it's such a great question. And, you know, I get the benefit of visiting a lot of universities across the country. I have my own sample size with my own children. And so you're right, there's real everyday pressure when you think about the burden of student debt, when you think about access to buying a home and the way interest rates are, the cost of home ownership, when you think about all of the burdens that our younger generation is facing. But I would also say is that our younger generation are dreamers. What I would also say is that when I talk to young people, and if I ask them what are their hopes and their dreams, they want to be able to have those basic things, but they also want to make sure that they're self-sufficient. They want to make sure that they're not transferring debt, but they're transferring wealth, which may not have been available for them with their parents. And so what I like to talk about is a few things with young people. One, I talk about that very first job. When you get your first job, max out on your 401k plan, unless you're comfortable with that benefit staying on the sidelines because you don't need that extra income. Two, you want to educate them about the importance of tax benefits and how, when you are contributing, what that benefit is and how that's working for you. And then I would say to young people is that it is so important that as you're preparing for today, you must prepare for tomorrow. The worst time to think about retirement is when you're ready to retire. The most important thing is to start early so that you can get the accumulating, the power of compounding. And so that when you are older, you will have optionality to be able to design your next chapter. But you have to start in your 20s and in your 30s. The worst time is in your 60s and your 70s. And I will tell you that when you connect with young people, they are listening. I think it's the responsibility of us to make sure that we're communicating in a way that they can receive the information in a way that they can understand the burdens that they have today, but also giving them practical steps and solutions to be able to save for tomorrow. So yes, there's a lot for our young people to contend with, but I think there's just a tremendous opportunity for us in the private sector to educate them, to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for them to take advantage of retirement benefits, and to make sure that they can feel confident that in their chapter in life, that will come faster than they think. They'll be very well prepared, and they're not transferring that to their children. I think the other thing I would say on that is we're living in a time where you have so much intergenerational. And when you think about today, so many of us are feeling that squeeze. We are in a position where we are taking care of mom and dad. Mom and dad may no longer live in the same household. We are also raising young children. So while we are trying to make sure we're taking advantage of 529 plans, while we're trying to make sure that we're taking care of our basic needs and buying a home and buying a car and helping our children save, we are also burdened with taking care of our parents. And so I do think that making sure that we can have those real conversations with our young people so that they can have a better circumstance than we did, I think is really important, especially as pensions are no longer there to provide that safety net.
A minute ago, you talked about annuities, and I remember when I was starting out in my career, they had a bad rap.
Yeah.
They could be complex, the fees could be high, there was just kind of a general sense of confusion about what they would be. I'd love to get your sense of how much that's been streamlined, how much you think the conversation surrounding them has changed, and also how you balance this notion of the benefits of having a kind of a simple process for retirement with optionality. I imagine that's something with which you have to kind of struggle day in and day out.
Well, the good thing is TIA has been in this business for over 100 years. And to just take a step back, TIA was founded by Andrew Carnegie, and he saw that there were thousands of professors that were educating the world's most brightest minds, but were retiring in poverty and not with dignity. And this was before Social Security. And so in effect, TIA created the first fixed annuity to make sure that there could be income that professors could have access to after they educated so many brilliant minds. And then we rolled out a variable annuity to make sure that we could keep up with inflation and get exposure to markets. So we have been in the business of guaranteed income for over 100 years. And I can tell you that not a day goes by that I hear from either a participant or a family member that says, thank you. My dad is now 90 years old and he's still getting that check. My mother is 80. Her husband passed away, and she's still able to get that check from TIAA. So the point is that guaranteed income was an annuity. It was in their retirement plan. And so when I think about where we are today, you're right, there's so many permutations around annuities, so many different flavors. And so we as an industry have to make sure that we can simplify it, or that people are clear on what it is that they have and what it means. So there is work that we are doing. But when I think about annuities within your allocation, it is not complicated. It is, you have exposure to the stock market, you have exposure to bonds, and then you have exposure to insurance. It's simple, it's part of your retirement allocation. It's different than a retail annuity. I think the most important thing is to understand what it is and what it's not. An annuity is not exposure to equities and alpha. Annuities give you longevity protection, it gives you consistency, and it gives you the confidence that you can have income that you won't outlive. And I think that in this environment is so important that we talk more about annuities, make sure people understand it, continue to do our job to simplify it and make sure people are educated around it. But providing access in retirement vehicles is what we've done for over 100 years in the 403B market, and we most recently have rolled it out in the 401k market.
So going back to 1918 and that initial $1 million contribution from Andrew Carnegie to where we are today, the company has grown tremendously, oversees $1.3, $1.4 trillion worth of assets. Can you just talk a bit about that investing strategy you were alluding to just a moment ago? It strikes me as kind of very lowercase c conservative. There's not a lot exotic about these main portfolios. Could you just talk about the company's approach to investing?
Well, for us at TIA and Naveen, we are liability driven. We want to make sure that we are investing in a way that our participants can feel confident that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, that the money will be there, it will be well invested, and they will be able to have income that they cannot outlive. And so when we look at what we're doing, we have our general account. We also, with Naveen, have third-party assets. And what's important there is whatever returns that we're getting from Naveen, that ultimately goes back to our participants. We return all of our earnings back to our participants. And so that allows them to get outside performance over time. And so within our company, we serve the 403B market. We've done that. That's a nod to our heritage. We will continue to do that. We see that there's tremendous opportunity to make sure the people that are helping and serving so many millions of Americans, whether it's higher ed and healthcare, can feel comfortable and confident about their retirement plan. But we're also, in partnership with Naveen, taking that benefit into the 401k market so that companies can add insurance into their allocation, and we're very excited about that. And of course, with respect to Naveen and their investment strategy, we do a lot in alternatives. So think about it as 85% of our general account is fixed income, 15% can be alternatives. And so that allows everyday participants through our general account to have access to alternatives, to have access to real estate, infrastructure, farmland, et cetera, PE, in a very safe way to generate more alpha for them. But the most important thing is that for us, it is liability driven. We want to make sure that we're investing in a way that will give them the performance and accumulation, but give them the confidence and decum that they will have income that they won't outlive and that we will be there for them.
Going back to the crisis, something that you proposed in an op-ed you wrote a couple weeks ago for the New York Times is more of a public-private partnership, more engagement with policymakers in the face of this crisis. Yeah. Here we are a few weeks into a new administration, a new Congress. How optimistic are you both about the appetite for that by the new president, by that Congress, and the level of engagement that we've seen so far on in retirement issues?
Yeah, the good news is when you're talking about retirement, it doesn't matter if you are in rural America, urban, suburban. It's not a blue state, it's not a red state issue. It absolutely is an American issue that we can all relate to. And so I am optimistic. And the reason why I'm optimistic is that the policy that we have been able to achieve over many years as an industry have been bipartisan. It did not matter who was in office. It did not matter what the ratios were between Democrats and Republicans. It was an issue that everyone came together on. And so I'm looking forward to us continuing to tell the story about how important retirement security is. I'm excited about some of the progress we've made with the Secure Act to make it easier for people to have access to retirement. And so that conversation will continue. We're looking forward to engaging with the new administration and talking about how do we continue to make sure that more Americans can have access to a secure retirement, and how do we make sure that by doing that, that can put less burden on Social Security. By doing that, that puts more money to work so that the caregivers, children, are not having to carry that burden. And so I do think that it will continue to be a bipartisan issue, and it is so important. We cannot close this retirement gap without private-public partnership. We have to have good policy, and we have to make sure that we in the private sector are doing our part to educate our employees, to make sure that the plans are designed so that people can have access no matter where they are within their employee base, whether they're senior executives or the people that are on the front line or working in the mailroom, having plans that are designed in a way where you have education, in a way that it has exposure to equities, bonds, and insurance, and having great policy so that more people can have access, to me, is the job to be done. And it is something that has to be done in both private and public sector.
I just want to turn to how you're navigating this moment. And you and I last spoke, it was a few years back during COVID. I did a piece on Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I asked you just about the long legacy of that. And we got to talking about DEI, got to talking about how you prioritize that within the company. I think you said it was a cornerstone of what TIAA has done. You, I'm sure, have paid attention to the recent conversation about that. Has it changed notionally the way that your company approaches these issues? What do you make of companies that have, in light of this increased scrutiny, stepped back from some of the commitments they've made before?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to it through the lens of TIAA and through the lens of me being a CEO. You know, I think that for us, our values are very clear. You know, and our values go back well over 100 years, and that will continue to remain. I've always said that talent is created equally, opportunity is not. And so if the objective is to continue a pursuit towards meritocracy, knowing that we started with exclusionary practices and not having everyone have access to entering corporate America, if the objective is excellence, if the objective is to make sure that we can cast the widest net across our country to attract the very best talent, to develop that talent, and to make sure that that talent stays, then the outcome will continue to be a diverse workforce, because I do believe that talent is there. And so for us, we will absolutely comply with every law, every regulation to the highest standard. And we also realize that there is a need for more talent. We also recognize that there are jobs to be done across our workplace to make sure that everyone feels that they can have access. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. And so when I think about the opportunity for us, I think the opportunity is to stay focused on our values, to stay focused on making sure that we can cast the widest net across our country, and that when people enter the workplace of TIAA, they wear one jersey, that's the TIAA jersey, and they're very aligned with our mission. And our mission is to ensure that millions of Americans can have a secure retirement. And I believe that if we stay focused on that, navigate whatever the environment is, always, complying to the highest standard, the outcome of talent will be a diverse workforce.
So just to be clear, when the president says last night with the sweep of a pen, he's ended DEI in government and in the private sector, nothing has changed yet in terms of your
we're
policies.
Always going to understand what the president of the United States is requiring for companies, and we'll comply. But what has not changed is our commitment to talent. What has not changed is making sure that we cast a wider net. And if the president is very much focused on excellence, then we are well positioned at TIAA to continue to make sure that we do just that, while making sure that we comply to any standards, any law, and any regulation, and we will absolutely do that.
You're in this kind of rarefied position. I think like the head of CalSTRS is probably in a similar one, where you're able to exert influence on the companies on whom you invest. You can make your opinions known about corporate board composition, for instance. Is that something that you continue to do, continue to prioritize, and does that stand to change with what's happened over these last few weeks?
Yeah, I think, clearly, making sure that we're navigating the environment and what executive actions, executive orders, laws, et cetera. And like I said, we'll make sure we do all of that. But, we're investing in thousands of companies. And it is important for us to understand who the company is, what they're about, what is their philosophy, what is their strategy, understanding their leadership. And so that won't change. If there's things that we have to edit, we'll navigate that. But as an institutional investor, it is very important where we're deploying our participants' money, we want to make sure that we're doing it well and that we understand the companies that we're investing in, so that our portfolio managers can have as much information as they can to make very sound decisions about the overall investment strategy.
You oversee this huge company that has its hand in so many things, and obviously you have to interface with regulators as well. Are you worried about the state of regulation in this country, that you have to interact with them at the state level, the federal level? Do you worry about the cuts that we're seeing in terms of the products that you offer, this broader conversation about what people have when they retire?
Well, the good news is we have a range of solutions, and that hasn't changed. So we haven't seen any impact there in terms of our investment strategy, in terms of what we're here to do. As I think about regulation, I think clearly the president's been clear in wanting to have some deregulation, and that will be a positive thing for companies. But regulation is good. You want to make sure that, we're in a regulated industry. We need to have sound regulation. Clearly, if there's opportunities to improve, the president's been clear about wanting to do that and what that can unleash in terms of companies and their earnings. But I think the most important thing is, one, for us, making sure that we're clear on what we're here to do, which is provide a secure retirement for millions of Americans, understanding the regulatory landscape and whatever laws that gets passed with the president and the new administration, and adhere to that. But never lose sight of the main thing, which is to make sure that we have sound investment practices, making sure we continue to attract the best talent, and make sure that we deliver on our retirees. Whatever the regulatory environment will be, we will navigate that. We've been around for 100 years. We've seen the highs, the lows, and everything in between. But what hasn't changed, regardless of the environment, is delivering for our participants, and that won't change, regardless of any shifts in the overall environment.
So last question, I'm curious how you were thinking about the economy, thinking about markets today. We lived through a lot just in the last 24 hours with the imposition of this trade war. How are you thinking about that level of uncertainty and what it means, bearing in mind that you're not dealing with investors who have a very short-term time horizon? They're looking out longer.
Well, you just said, I think the operative word is uncertainty. I think there is a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace, which is causing consumer confidence to wane. If you are a participant of ours, you're looking at your portfolio and you're seeing a lot of market volatility. When we think about tariffs, there's a lot of questions. Will it stay? What will it mean? Clearly higher costs for everyday Americans around gas, around food, around purchases of auto loans, burdens everyday Americans. But it's not just the tariffs, right? I mean, we still have the geopolitical uncertainty. We have questions around the labor market with respect to immigration. We have an aging population exiting the workforce. So there's a lot of considerations. Interest rates, what will happen? Will we get to 2% inflation? Will interest rates drop? We're seeing a little bit of movement in the 10-year today. And so there is a lot of uncertainty. I think the most important thing that we tell our retirees is exactly what you said. This is about your retirement. And so when there is market volatility, the most important thing is to take a breath, talk to an advisor to make sure you get sound advice, restate what your objectives are, what your time horizons are. Maybe there needs to be a rebalance of your portfolio to make sure you're navigating turbulent times, but stay diversified, stay invested, and make sure that they're getting sound advice so that they can feel confident about their retirement plan. And for us, making sure that they feel confident about our overall investment strategy and what we're doing long-term to make sure that they can have confidence that income will be the outcome for them. But there is a lot to navigate, as you said, and a lot of uncertainty.
Very quickly, I said at the top, it's easy to feel pessimistic or despair about this retirement crisis. Are you optimistic it can be solved here in the coming years?
Look, I think as leaders, we must be optimistic because we're the ones leading. And when I think about retirement, I do think that there is opportunity. As I said, this is a bipartisan issue. Sound policy matters. And when our team and when I am in DC, people want to talk about retirement, senators, congressmen on both sides of the aisle. And so I'm optimistic that that conversation will continue. I'm optimistic that companies will continue to make sure that they're looking at their retirement plans, that they're asking ourselves questions. Are we educating our workforce? Do they understand the benefits that they have? Are the benefits accessible to everyone, and is everyone taking advantage of it? I am excited about the investment solutions, the products that we're rolling out and we're designing to make sure that it can be in everyone's plan, not just the 403B market, but the 401k market. And I'm optimistic that with sound policy, more Americans can have access to a dignified retirement. More Americans can accumulate earlier and be able to have confidence. There's some real headwinds. Social Security is a headwind. An aging population and the stress of that is a headwind. But ultimately, I think that this is something that we can do more, and I think this is something that we at TIA are committed to doing just that. So I have to be optimistic.
Deshanda, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Please welcome to the stage Vaughn Bowman, CEO of MML Investor Services and Head of Wealth Management at Mass Mutual, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Michelle Lin.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Lin, Global Head of Data Science and Insight for the Bloomberg Media Organization, and I'm joined by Vaughn Bowman, CEO of MML Investor Services and Head of Wealth Management at Mass Mutual for the Mass Mutual Sponsor Spotlight, from advisor to CEO, proactively evolving your mindset. Thank you, Vaughn, for being with us here today.
Thank you, Michelle. It's great to be here.
We're going to jump right in. So as financial advisors are navigating economic and market uncertainty, what should they focus on to provide great service for existing clients and grow to serve more clients?
Well, so there's an old saying that I'm a big fan of that really comes to mind in this question, which is the cobbler's children go barefoot. That applies sometimes to financial advisors as well. As much as they are focusing in on client service to make sure that their clients are taken care of in all aspects of their financial lives, sometimes they need to take a step back and make sure their own houses are in order. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Just over the last few months, I've had dozens of conversations with many of our financial advisors, and the same phenomenon happens again and again. By virtue of becoming a really great advisor, surprise, surprise, you end up getting more and more clients. And as that happens, you find yourself having to maintain that high level of client service, but also still keeping track of the markets, still thinking about the economy, all the tax law changes that are going on, and 1,000 other little things as well. And particularly if you're going it alone as a financial advisor, that is very, very hard to do. That's why actually an advisor of ours just a few months ago said to me, you know, it's like I woke up one morning and I realized I was an accidental CEO.
Accidental CEO, what do you mean by that?
So when you think about the skills that financial advisors learn throughout their careers, and it applies to many of us in the room here at Bloomberg Invest, they learn how to service clients. They learn money. They learn markets. They don't necessarily go to business school and learn how to run a business. And that's a big difference. So just as a CEO has to make staffing decisions, they have to delegate their time and decide what tasks to do and how to spend every hour of every day. They have to make decisions on all these important things. Advisors find themselves in that situation, and it becomes even more relevant the better and larger an advisor's client base becomes. And that's a problem. It's a good problem to have, but it is a problem.
So what would be your advice for advisors that find themselves in that situation?
So a couple things. I think, first of all, first and foremost, it's really to embrace it. It's to run towards the concept of being a CEO as opposed to away from it. And I think forming a vision of what you want your client interactions to look like and feel like is a good first step. How do you want your clients to feel when they walk into your office? How do you want your clients to feel when they walk out of your office? Do you have, in one sentence, a way to describe the value that clients get when they work with you? It's those kind of questions that advisors should be asking themselves. And I will say, it may sometimes take being creative as an advisor. If you're lucky enough to have a company behind you that can provide you with good resources to be able to do this, that's absolutely great. But you may have to branch out and reach out to people that can help you think independently about the problems that you're trying to solve in your business. So I'm a big fan, for example, of hiring a personal coach. I think that an objective view can help you as an advisor really take it to the next level.
And what is MassMutual's interest in this?
Well, at MassMutual, we've been investing side by side in the success of our advisors for many, many decades now. Just in the last couple of years, we've really doubled down on that journey in a number of different ways. So first of all, recognizing the huge importance of human advice in clients' financial lives, and that's a theme here throughout Bloomberg Invest that we hear again and again, the complexity of financial lives of our clients and the need for human advice. And then it's providing the right products, the right platforms, and the right people to be able to help advisors navigate that world. And that could be, portfolio construction, it could be financial planning, it could be any number of different tools. And really, a big part of it is planning for that business and, as I said, what you want it to look like 3, 5, 10 years down the road. So things like client acquisition and client service model, things like succession planning and starting to think about how you want your clients to be served, not just for the next few years, but for their lifetimes. And those kind of tools are invaluable to helping advisors grow their practice, make sure that they're running it like a business, and of course, serving their clients the best way that they possibly can. So, with a combination of all the things we're doing at MassMutual Financial Advisors to be able to provide our advisors with these resources, we think we're putting them in a really, really good position to serve clients the best way possible and change from being an accidental CEO to being an intentional CEO.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on proactively evolving your mindset as part of the MassMutual Sponsor Spotlight.
Thanks, Michelle.
Financial advisors the best of both worlds. With our innovative supported independence model, we're giving you freedom with resources you need to run your business, helping you make a name for yourself with our good name behind you, freeing you to offer clients the advice they need, and making sure you're properly compensated for that advice. When it comes to wealth management, we choose to lead.
we're quite bullish on Japan. Japan is a must-own country today.
Please welcome to the stage Joseph Bay, co-CEO of KKR, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Sonali Basak.
Thank you for joining, Joe. I think I've been trying to get you for this interview for the last 3 years.
Great to be here.
You saw a little bit about what KKR is up to. It's a roughly $640 billion asset manager today with ambitious goals to expand to $1 trillion under management by 2030, and it's closely being watched across Wall Street. And we're going to get to some of the things underpinning those goals, but first we're going to start with a big view on where the world stands today. And as we've been talking about, Joe, in the US, investors are trying to shake off that tariff hangover that exists right now. The markets have been very jittery. Investors are digesting how these trade policies could be in the future. How do you view the impact from your seat?
Sure. I think it's obvious to everybody that we're in an environment right now where there's a lot of uncertainty around trade tariffs, but it's not necessarily new. Even with the first Trump administration, he was focused on tariffs and trade. Biden kept most of those tariffs in place. So I think in our business, we're very long-term investors. We need to be thinking about these issues over time, not just in one administration. And what I'd say is, we have teams at KKR who focus on all these areas of macro risk, whether that's currency risk, tariff and trade, geopolitical risk, regulatory risk, in each of the different markets that we're investing in. I think this issue around supply chain security and resiliency, which relates to tariffs, is obviously front and center for all long-term investors. But people are trying to parse through what this all means. The final policies are not in place. The actions of other countries and governments in reaction to what Trump may or may not do is still unknown. So it's very fluid at the moment. And I think that's obviously creating some uncertainty and volatility.
It's interesting. In conversation with you, you had mentioned that this was a risk that you should have seen coming in a lot of ways. So from where I'm sitting, it looks like KKR has been preparing for this in a way that many investors have kind of very obviously have not been. So what have you been doing to prepare for all of this uncertainty, knowing that there's even more of it ahead?
Yeah, so I think, we have over 150 companies in our private equity portfolio around the world. So again, supply chain resiliency, multiple sourcing avenues for our companies has always been a part of the risk mitigation approach. And we've spent a lot of time really over the last 5, 6, 7 years understanding that risk and mitigating that risk. And when it comes to new investments, I think a big part of our job thematically is understanding the risk environment we're in and choosing those themes and sectors and opportunities that really have less exposure to tariff risk or trade risk. So maybe a couple of examples of that is, healthcare services are very domestic, whether it's in the US, Europe, or Asia. That's an area where we feel like the tariff risk, at least, is not a pronounced risk. You could look at certain services businesses. We've made a number of investments in companies like home services, foundation inspection, maintenance companies in the US for an aging housing stock. You look at IT services and software investments in different countries. Again, very little tariff risk. So you're able to really zero in and target those industries and sectors where you don't think this is going to be a big problem.
When you think about the ripple effects that you might see from the tariff strategy, there are a lot of concerns about inflation,
Sure.
growth. How are you thinking about the economic headwinds that the US is facing?
Listen, I think that's one of the big uncertainties out there that people are trying to figure out. Tariffs are inflationary by design. So I think if that leads to an escalated level of inflation in the US economy, obviously that's going to slow GDP growth. It may put some pressure on the Fed, obviously, in a more tough economic environment to lower rates faster over time. But we've always felt that the bigger trends happening in the world, whether that's energy transition, the massive investments into data, a lot of these things are inflationary by its nature, putting aside tariffs. right? So we have a higher resting heart rate for inflation globally today than we've had in the last decade.
And you expect that to continue?
And potentially even get higher inflation, right? If these tariff and these trade wars continue, it's not an unreasonable expectation that in the near term, you could see higher inflation.
Well, doesn't that mean higher rates? Or do you think that the Fed is going to have to lower rates into the face of that? People are starting to use the word stagflation an awful lot these days.
I think it's going to be different in different markets. And I think the Fed's going to have to be very nimble in how they navigate this risk. Obviously, if the US is headed towards an economic downturn, cutting rates is probably going to be the policy response. If rates are high and we're not headed down that recession path or deceleration of growth path, then rates could actually go a little bit higher in the near term.
So let's look at this from a global perspective as well. I think one unique view you can bring from KKR is that you are very global in nature, so you see the way that the changes are happening in the tariff strategy, the way that nations are kind of separating in their relationship to each other. You see that on the ground through your portfolio companies.
Yeah.
What are then other areas of the world that are maybe even more attractive to you than the United States right now?
Well, I think it's not a secret. You had it up on the slide. We're big fans right now of Japan. We think that is a really, really underpenetrated opportunity, especially among US investors. They really haven't figured out how to get the exposure they want in a market like Japan, where they're coming out of 2.5 decades of deflation. So finally, positive wage growth, pricing power, inflation is very modest, but positive inflation right now, and rates are actually increasing modestly in Japan. That's a completely different macro picture than what we've seen in Japan for the last 3 decades. And a really exciting time when you marry that with shareholder reform, activism, corporate governance reform in that market. Outside of the United States today, Japan is the largest destination of our capital.
So it's interesting. In addition to Japan, KKR has maintained a commitment to China as well. In fact, there are big deals that are in the market that KKR may be involved with at this very moment. So a lot of other investors are very worried about China, the internal economics and the relationship that China has to the United States.
Yeah.
How do you view that dynamic?
Yeah, listen, I think the geopolitical tensions right now obviously are front and center for us as we think about where to invest and how to invest. And in China in particular, you have to avoid those sectors that have sensitivity on both sides of the ocean, both the US government and the Chinese government. So we have not invested in some of these sensitive sectors like electric vehicles or semiconductors or AI. That's not the focus of our China investment strategy. We're really focusing on super high quality domestic businesses that are around domestic consumption and services. So in our portfolio today, we have one of the largest, or the largest Chinese pet food company. Again, geopolitically not sensitive. We own one of the largest pharmacy chains in China. We own the largest white mushroom grower in China, all geared towards the domestic market, a growing middle class who wants higher quality goods and services and food. And I think that's the sweet spot of where we're focused in the market today.
That's interesting because even if you're focused on the Chinese consumer, that might be a little more insulated to, let's say, the global macro challenges. There are a lot of concerns about the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
Why are you seeing through them?
Yeah, listen, I think the overall long-term trend in China is the middle class is growing. And the expectations of the middle class are really for higher quality goods and services. Safer food, safer services. And that's what these companies that we're investing behind are really catering towards. No doubt the macro growth in China has slowed from a decade ago, right? You were talking about a country growing at double digits GDP. They're targeting 4 to 5% growth today, right? So there has been a slowdown. There's clearly challenges in terms of the real estate market in China. And you have to factor all that in terms of the growth rate you're underwriting and largely the entry multiple. The Chinese stock market today is one of the most interesting value markets in the world in terms of the multiples. So if you know what you're looking for, the type of risk you're trying to mitigate against, you could still find some interesting opportunities.
Yesterday I asked the question, is American exceptionalism dead? In addition to that, I ask you, is globalization a diversification play? Is it a safety trade? How do you think about it?
Well, we are a very, very global firm, and we have a lot of different ways to participate in those opportunities. Private equity, real estate, private credit, and infrastructure. So in really volatile periods like we're in right now, having that flexibility of capital, we could partner with companies, management teams, as a provider of anything from senior investment grade debt, right, to non-investment grade debt, to structured credit solutions, structured equity solutions, growth equity capital, to buyout capital. So, today it's an interesting market. When volatility spikes, that usually leads to really, really interesting deployment opportunities for our firm. You need to be nimble. You need to have the local reach in all these different markets. But we're excited, quite frankly, about 2025. There are going to be hiccups. There's going to be some headwinds in terms of some of these macro policies. But our ability to deploy scaled capital around the world, we think, is quite high.
I will still ask you, if not dead, then is American exceptionalism then overblown?
No, listen, I think this notion that the U.S. is going to win alone has never been the case. I think the strength of the United States is really the resiliency of the economy, the strength of our capital markets to mobilize capital to support companies in the private sector, and labor productivity, right? When you think about why the U.S. has grown faster than Europe or faster than Japan, it's really about labor productivity in the United States. A lot of that is technology-driven and innovation-driven, but a lot of that is our unique mobility of labor in this country, right? You think about Japan, which is going through this resurgence. Structurally, they've done the best job of any country in terms of women participation in the workforce, people working longer in Japan, right? They've got real demographic challenges. They've done an excellent job around automation and robotics in their industrial base. But they're not getting the labor productivity because the mobility of labor in Japan is quite constrained. And their investment in software and tech is a fraction of what you see in the United States, right? So the real superpower of the United States is labor productivity at the end of the day.
I do want to spend the remaining time here switching gears, talking about the future of KKR, because it's been fascinating to watch the change from an iconic private equity company to what you are today. There was the full acquisition of your insurance company last year, Global Atlantic, and it's made KKR look more and more like Berkshire Hathaway. And there's one part of your business that's far less understood that I think makes you look like the most like Berkshire Hathaway, and that's your strategic holdings business. Many people don't know that KKR owns 18 companies on your own balance sheet at KKR. What is this business going to be in maybe 10 years, and why is it valuable to you?
Sure. So when you think about KKR as a business, we really have three core strategic parts of our business strategy. Asset management, I think, is well understood. It's what we're known for the last 50 years. So that's our third-party private equity, again, real estate, infrastructure, private credit business. And that's the $650 billion business that you mentioned at the start. The second big pillar of our business today is Global Atlantic. It's a 100% owned insurance company in the life and annuity space, roughly $190 billion of AUM there. And again, playing into all of these trends around retirement savings, retirement security, and being able to offer individuals compelling products for their own long-term savings. The third piece of it is a segment that we introduced last year at our Investor Day, but it's been a segment we've been incubating for well over a decade now at KKR, and that's strategic holdings. So what we're trying to build in strategic holdings is, in some ways, a mini Berkshire Hathaway, right? These are companies where we own large stakes, sometimes controlling stakes, sometimes not, but businesses that we think we could own literally forever, businesses that have the potential to compound in mid-teens over a very, very long period of time, very defensive in nature. So we have 18 companies in that portfolio today. We're going to continue to redeploy our free cash flow at KKR to invest in more of these types of businesses. And it's not just private equity. Over time, it's going to include certain platforms, probably in infrastructure and real assets, maybe certain buildups, that we're going to do in different sectors. When Scott Nuttall and I, my co-CEO, joined KKR back in 1996, Berkshire Hathaway had a market cap of $40 billion and roughly an NAV balance sheet of $40 billion. You fast forward 28 years, they have $1 trillion market cap on the back of long-term compounding of their balance sheet and their investments, right? Some version of that is what we're going to be doing with strategic holdings, but leveraging all of the skills and expertise we have in our private equity teams, our infrastructure teams around the world.
So what's an interesting parallel here? If you think about Berkshire Hathaway, is it almost like Global Atlantic is your own Geico, and these future infrastructure holdings will be your BNSF, and your private equity holdings would be kind of like your stock portfolio?
Yes, it's an imperfect analogy, but directionally you are absolutely right. I think, listen, strategic holdings for us, you got to think about it as a way, how do we think about redeploying our free cash flow as a business back into the most attractive areas? Some of that might be in our traditional, third-party asset management business, right? If we find great ways to deploy capital across those investments, we'll deploy that capital. A lot of the capital is reinvested back into Global Atlantic. We acquired our first controlling stake in Global Atlantic in 2020, and GA at that time had around $70 billion of AUM. 4 years later, it has $190 billion of AUM. So we've supported that growth with more investment. And then this third segment of strategic holdings, obviously, which is what we're super excited about, is one where we're going to be continuing to invest a lot more of our free cash flow as a business. So our guidance to the street today is by 2026, that portfolio will be generating around $350+ million of after-tax dividends for us. That's growing to $700 million by 2028 and $1.1 billion by 2030. So it is a very, very visible, recurring, growing cash flow stream at KKR.
So you essentially have a kind of a future unicorn of sorts being built inside of KKR. If you're going to be bringing in $1 billion over time in this business, do you think it's built into KKR stock, that assumption yet?
I think people are starting to appreciate what we're trying to build. But I think the bigger picture is when you look at our universe in the alt space, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think many of the public peers in the sector are going to actually take very different approaches to how do they grow their firms. I think the approach we have with third-party asset management, insurance, and strategic holdings is quite differentiated and different than the way most of our peers are trying to grow their firms today.
Now, I want to spend a little time talking about not just institutional capital and how you are deploying capital in your own balance sheet. We've been talking so much about how there's been a massive push for retail when it comes to the world of private assets. Everyone is doing it differently. You have a relationship with Capital Group in order to make this available in a mutual fund form. So how available is it to invest in private assets from where you're sitting? What's the minimum amount you would need to put into a fund to start to get access to what you're offering?
Sure. So the way to think about the bigger picture opportunity is, for most of our history at KKR, we were founded in 1976. Our core client base was really large institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds around the world. The individual investors who participated with us were really ultra high net worth families and family offices who could allocate capital as part of their diversification as really LPs in our funds. They were sophisticated investors willing to take that 10 or 12 year illiquidity risk, just like a pension fund would. So that's a very small percent of the households, obviously, in the United States. But that's how they've accessed and partnered with us historically. What's relatively new for us in the last 2 to 3 years is we've introduced a series of private wealth products for individual investors who are accredited investors. Okay, so those are investors with a net worth of, call it, $1 to $5 million. These open-ended evergreen products have semi-liquidity features, so you're not locking up your capital for 10 to 12 years. You have the ability, if you need it, to redeem a portion of your capital every quarter. So it's a slightly different format, but it's investing in exactly the same deals that our flagship funds are investing in, right? So we're trying to deliver that same institutional quality experience, the same portfolio, the same access to deal flow, whether that's in private equity, real estate, infrastructure, or private credit, to individual accredited investors, right, in that $1 to $5 million in net worth. That's around 10% of the households in the United States in those first two buckets, ultra high net worth and accredited investors, and roughly half the AUM in the individual channel. With Capital Group, we have an exciting new partnership which really addresses the next 90% of US households. These are mass affluent individual investors who probably wouldn't be buying our private wealth product and wouldn't be LPs in our traditional fund. So we're creating hybrid products with Capital Group in a mutual fund format. We're starting with credit in the second quarter, where we're going to be putting a portfolio together where Capital Group manages the public credit. We will manage the private credit allocation in that mutual fund and deliver a product to the mass affluent that looks very different from anything they've been able to buy before.
You know, it feels like the holy grail for this industry is making private assets available in 401k plans.
Yes.
How soon do you think that happens? And if not that soon, what's the biggest barrier?
Well, listen, I think, again, at a high level, when you think about some of the societal challenges we have, a big part of that is securing your retirement, right? As you retire from work, people are living longer, the demographic trends are pretty clear. Individuals need to have more agency and control of their retirement security. So the question is, how can policymakers working with the asset management industry create more of that long-term security for savers and retirees? Historically, individuals have not had access to the alt space, which is what we're talking about. Certainly not through their 401k plans. So the opportunity is really over time to create a pathway for those savers through their 401k plans to allocate a certain portion of that to the alt space. That's going to require government regulatory policy change. And again, I think this administration is probably more open-minded to that. But if Social Security is going to come under pressure and corporate pension plans are going to come under pressure, again, from a societal standpoint, individual investors need better ways to compound their wealth in their retirement.
Before I let you go, I want to go back to one more question about that strategic holdings business, because I know it's one that a lot of people don't know a lot about. I know even all your rivals are watching very, very closely. You have 18 businesses that you own. How many more businesses are you looking to buy, and what would it take to be the next business to be owned by KKR on your balance sheet?
Listen, I think we are looking for, again, businesses that we would be happy to own for either a very long time or forever, right? Businesses that we think can compound equity value at mid-teens plus kind of rates. Businesses generally that are very defensive, cash flow oriented in nature. So when you think about that kind of profile, you know, it's actually not a lot of companies that you'd want to own for 10, 15, 20 years, right? Very, very few. So the bar set very, very high for what goes in strategic holdings. But again, it's not just it's private equity today, those 18 companies. Over time, I think what's exciting is we could think about infrastructure in a different way. We could think about build-ups in a different way. So the strategy there is going to evolve over time. And it's really a question for us. We're going to generate as a firm $25 billion of free cash flow in the next 5 years. How do we want to allocate that capital? How much of that should be used for strategic holdings? How much of that should be used to grow our insurance segment? And how much of that, again, should be used to expand our asset management business? The answer is all three are going to get investment. It's just where are the best opportunities?
As we do at Bloomberg, we will always be on the hunt for your next deal. Joe, we thank you so much for your time here. We thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Please welcome to the stage Anne-Marie Fink, Chief Investment Officer, Private Markets and Funds Alpha at the State of Wisconsin Investment Board, Yup Kim, Chief Investment Officer of the Texas Municipal Retirement System, and Stephen Meyer, Chief Investment Officer and Deputy Comptroller for Asset Management at the New York City Retirement Systems, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick.
I'm going to get this right, don't worry. All right. Thank you. All right, we're all seated and all ready. You comfortable?
I'm very comfortable.
All right, we're all here. We got a Wisconsinite, a New Yorker, a Texan. They all walk into a bar. Who's picking up the tab? Look, you guys have done very well with your funds over the last few years, but a lot's changed over the last few months. And I know you have an eye towards the long term, but the short term influences that dramatically. Has your risk outlook changed at all, Anne-Marie?
Not really. I would say we're barbelling a little bit, given what's going on right now. We have about 30% in privates on our way to 35. And the idea there is that we can really see through the volatility and pay less attention to it. Because we're thinking sort of more long-term. And then within our more public portfolio, we are we're putting a lot of money with managers that can be very nimble and respond to some of the noise and, move around and take advantage of some of the volatility that we're seeing.
And Steve, I mean, you have a big opportunistic desk under your wing as well, right?
We do. Yeah, I would echo what Anne-Marie said. We're strategic, we're not tactical. Although it's hard not to be paying attention to the headlines of the new administration's creating in Washington. We also get a lot of questions from our pension beneficiaries and participants. So we have 800,000 folks that we support and service in the New York City retirement system. So we do stay on top of it. As Anne-Marie said, we do pick managers that can be tactical. Again, we're strategic at $294 billion. We're not nimble. We're not designed to be nimble, and we shouldn't attempt to be nimble.
Yep. I mean, just generally on risk, how are you viewing it right now?
And Romain, I have a confession to make. Today is my 40th birthday.
Oh.
And so on top of all this market volatility, I begin today equal part anxious and equal part excited. And so like, I think maybe three key things. I think, number one, kind of the core ingredients that really excited everyone around U.S. exceptionalism in the next decade, those things have not changed, right? The U.S. continues to have academic institutions that are the envy of the world. When I talk to kind of my investor peers in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, the U.S. is still on the top of that list. You have founders and tenured management teams that are among the best in the world. And what's really unique, we have access to energy, and we do have kind of a risk-taking culture that is celebrated. And that is that's just really not found in many parts of the world. And so I do think while we can be swayed by short-term market volatility, I do think the U.S. When we ask the question, where does equity value be created in the next decade? The U.S. still has so many advantages, and so we're very excited.
So you would
about
put your money on U.S. outperformance versus the rest of the world long term?
In the next decade, yes.
In the long term.
Yes.
Steve, you
I
feel
would
the
say
same
the
way?
same. Yeah, I would agree that we have some structural advantages in the U.S. Europe's had a little bit of trouble coordinating their activities across the countries and different constituents. But we've got, we're the largest economy in the world. We've got a deep pool of capital markets and liquidity. We've got a very high per capita income in the United States. We've got rule of law, which hopefully won't change. As I said, I think those things will really help drive performance over time.
Anne-Marie, you feel the same way?
We're a little bit more balanced, I would say, in terms of our equity exposure. So mostly, I would agree with everything that my co-panelists said. That the multiples, though, certainly the U.S. is pretty expensive, so we're more balanced, at least in our equities. In our fixed income, our real estate, we're much more domestic, and then somewhere in between with our privates, our private equity and private credit.
Yeah, and just to comment on what Anne said earlier, I do think this is a time to prepare for kind of situational dislocations and maybe even systemic distress in different pockets of private markets, right? I think you have such a large share of venture-backed companies with less than a year of cash runway. You have pockets of distress, obviously, in real estate, and even in private credit land, you're starting to see some pretty big issues kind of emanate. And so I do think it's really difficult to really kind of plunge and really invest in a falling knife type environment. But I think it's really important for everyone as there's increased geopolitical and macro volatility to kind of prepare for some
and
of
this
those
has been unfolding for a while. I mean, we saw a drop in allocations at the start of 2024 into private markets. Steve, though, you leaned a little bit into that. You're actually expanding your
Yeah, I mean, we actually had a change in legislation and impacts the city of New York. So we're actually, we are in the process of increasing our exposure to alternative or private assets from 25% to 35%. I'd say the average allocation across our 5 plans is between 10 and 12% private equity. So it's been an advantage at a time when everyone else is pulling back and exits have been harder to come by. Performance hasn't been great in private equity, but I think it's a great time to be putting money to work. We were able to get better access to the top decile performers, to get size and scale, to negotiate better terms, better economics, and a healthy slug of co-investment as well, typically no fee, no carry. So those are things that I think will positively impact the portfolio longer term, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years out.
How important has that co-investment trend been to furthering return?
For us, it's been incredibly valuable. I mean, there's multiple ways of looking at it. Is it just a volume discount that you're getting? Maybe, but we've found in general, our co-invest book is about just under 20% of our overall private equity, private credit. And the returns there have been considerably higher than in our core book. The not paying fees makes a big difference. The other thing that we're doing, and we in real estate similar, we're about actually close to half of our book is in joint, not in funds, so in joint ventures or co-invest. So it's been a huge driver for us, and it's an advantage that I guess all three of us probably have, is that we're just much bigger plans. So I've got the staff that we can do that, whereas smaller plans may not have that ability.
It's also a matter of net returns that we talked about before we came out today. So it really helps to drive the net returns of the portfolio. The other thing, and I hate to say this in this environment, so I know I may alienate some people in the audience. I'm concerned about the level of fees we do pay. Private equity, infrastructure, continued real estate, private credit. I still think we need to be very sensitive around fees. We're trying to develop metrics that actually can look at the alpha generated per unit of fee. So for us, it's all about net returns, and we're trying to be disciplined around that. And I think in the current environment where a lot of other investors are either constrained because of liquidity reasons or just pulling back and rethinking their exposures, to put more money to work, you get better vintage year diversification. It's also almost impossible at our sizes and scale to lean in and out of these markets. So you want to be a consistent investor over time.
Is there consistent alpha out there, or are you just getting index performance?
Yeah, so I think there are, so co-investments is a critical pillar of our private markets, strategy and approach. And, from a portfolio construction standpoint, you're really able to build kind of high conviction, idiosyncratic exposures behind your highest conviction ideas. You're able to better manage liquidity because you don't, you have less committed, uncalled capital that you're managing on a day-to-day basis. And just from a team development standpoint, you're really able to kind of be thematic on where you want to spend time. You're able to build professional networks across your active mandates. And ultimately, I think the days of relying on, to Stephen's point, kind of the past 15 years is not, the next 15 years is not going to look like the past 15 years. And so trying to, kind of paying yesterday's fees on tomorrow's returns will get you to a bad place, right? And so I do think, many general partners have been very accommodating and very partner-oriented in terms of making sure that gross to net spread reduces. But I do think it's incumbent upon limited partners to think very critically and intelligently on how to deliver kind of really thoughtful net returns to our beneficiaries.
I mean, how much say do you have? I mean, in terms of, when you talk about limited partners, you are kind of the 800-pound gorilla of limited partners in that private, particularly in the private credit space, and certainly in other parts as well. I mean, how much traction have you got in maybe trying to articulate what Steve and Yup just said? Not to get you in trouble or anything.
Yeah, I would say it's been challenging. The general partners are very good at divide and conquer. So the number of times I've had a general partner tell me, well, you're asking for this term, nobody else has asked for it. I'm like, yeah, but it's good for LPs, so I'm pretty sure they wouldn't be upset if you gave it to us. So I do think that it is something that is going to evolve. And to Yup's point, at least when I look, we're believers in private equity, and we like it, and we do think it will continue to outperform public equity over the next 10 to 15 years. That said, the next 10 to 15 years, I don't think are going to be as good as the last 10 to 15 years in private equity, right? We've had multiples go up. We've had cost of debt come down. So you've had these huge tailwinds that really benefited private equity. And so the gross returns were really good, and then we were maybe a little less discerning on how much of that gross to net we got. As we go forward, if I'm correct that multiples won't go up, like I bought it at 10 times, I sold it at 15. If that goes away, I have to buy it at 15 and fix it and then sell it at 15. If that goes away, and then also the cost of capital goes away, the gross return is going to be lower. And so again, we want all of our managers to get very wealthy, but only if we're getting the returns for our beneficiaries. So as long as we're aligning those interests, we are happy to work on it, but I think going forward, we are going to all be more discerning about the fees that we're paying.
You're nodding your head. Public,
Yeah.
so private outperforms public with an asterisk.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, we've had incredible return in U.S., particularly large cap equities since the global financial crisis. So that U.S. exceptionalism really is driven by, you could call it mega cap exceptionalism or large cap tech exceptionalism. I don't know that that continues. I think if you look at the next 10 years, the average return is probably high to mid single digits for public equity. I do think you'll see a rebound in private equity. I also think private equity, we shouldn't say this, but I think it's a better business model. It's a better alignment of incentives. It's longer term looking. There's a lower reporting requirement. It just seems like a better way to generate alpha over time. Again, I think to Yip's point earlier, though, you have to be very selective in terms of the managers you pick. You really want to pick those that have a demonstrated ability to drive value creation, not simply buying something and hoping for a multiple expansion, but those that are more strategic or can impose efficiencies into their companies.
Yeah, and I do think just the quality of beta going forward might have headwinds, but I do think the opportunity for alpha in the next 12 to 18 months is tremendous, right? I do think we have to kind of take a deep breath, right, with a lot of this macroeconomic volatility, and just remind ourselves that we've partnered with world-class investors who will make good decisions on M&A, on supply chain management, on all these things, because the administration's kind of go-forward policies will have very asymmetric implications on tech versus healthcare versus consumer, industrials, financial services, business services. And so to the astute and skilled investor, who we're partnered with, who can make the right calls, I think there is outsized alpha to be had in this environment.
Now, for all three of you, obviously the returns you're trying to generate, of course, are also going to be sensitive to inflation. Inflation expectations have started to come up over the last couple of months, primarily because of some of those policies out of Washington.
Yeah.
Have you made any adjustments yet in your models? Is it too early?
We haven't made any adjustments, though we do have about 18% in tips. So we've been long believers in the inflation protection that we get through that. In addition, you get some inflation protection through some of the equity. If companies can pass through the inflation, you also get it through equity, both public and private. So we haven't done anything specific, but we do feel like we're reasonably protected.
We feel that we have a good amount of inflation protection through our real assets, real estate, and infrastructure in particular. Also equities, public equities, and private assets as well. Tips.
So you don't need a direct inflation.
We don't. We actually held tips. We divested from tips in 2024. And the reason was that in 2022-23, when inflation kicked up, the tips pricing was really more of a function of 10-year inflation expectations, which didn't move as much. And yet you still had an index that had a duration of over 6.6, which meant that in a rising interest rate environment, its performance wasn't quite as bad as nominals, but it wasn't good. And we think we just can find better inflation hedges in real assets.
Yeah, and the same. I think both public and private companies have become incredibly good at preempting, price increases, right? Ahead of kind of forecasted increase to their cost structure, and I do think you just have natural kind of inflation hedges built into the portfolio, and so we're not doing anything incremental, kind of on that front.
So within the realm of real assets, I mean, where specifically are you finding opportunity? Like, what's specifically attractive in that space? Anne-Marie?
I would say a variety of things. So one, we've been leaning a little bit into senior housing post the pandemic, a lot of those assets were quite distressed, and so we were finding some good opportunities there. Within industrial and warehouses have been on fire for a while. The way we're tackling that is to do some development. So we've focused more on development than buying pre-existing assets there, and a little bit staying away from the Inland Empire in California and going broader with our industrial. And then the last thing that we're looking at, we haven't quite gotten there yet, though, is on office. I mean, office is clearly the asset class within real estate that's having the toughest time. And we actually had one loan where we to an office building where we now own the office building. So we're doing a little bit there, and then we're trying to be ready when we think the values have bottomed.
I take it you didn't want to own that office building originally.
That wasn't the initial intention, but we're hopeful that it will.
Hopefully own it at a good price.
But what with all the talk, though, about nearshoring and trying to bring more stuff, manufacturing back to the U.S., as well as more hard services back to the U.S., does that create an infrastructure opportunity as well?
It does. So we're obviously big investors in infrastructure as well. We like it. There's a big play right now in data centers, which Anne-Marie's smiling. We talked earlier, data centers winds its way into your portfolio through infrastructure, through real estate. We have a little residual exposure to data centers in our private equity book as well. But yeah, there's going to be obviously more investments in infrastructure here and abroad. Our infrastructure book is basically 55% U.S., 45% non-U.S., mostly in Europe. So we do think that some of the developments in Europe will also continue to power opportunities there and the performance we see out of Europe.
I'm curious, I mean, you were talking about American exceptionalism, but you're also finding opportunities outside the U.S.
Absolutely. Yeah, so just the broad framework I use on any investing is, quality of the market, quality of the business, quality of the management team, and then quality of the price/transaction/security. Clearly it's well recognized that, U.S. markets are probably on a relative basis the strongest. And so you have, A markets, A businesses, A management teams, but probably like a B minus C plus price, right? Even the public, equities markets, S&P trades at 22 times versus 10 and 14 times of the European and Asian equivalents. And so I do think that investors make a mistake by not looking at, Asian and European opportunities, because while the market quality might be B minus, your price is an A plus. And so kind of on a holistic basis, I think there are kind of accretive, opportunities, to be had. And so there's going to be a lot of volatility, kind of coming ahead. And so again, while the market beta for some of these economies won't be as compelling, for the astute investor, there will be a lot of alpha to be had.
Does geographic diversity equal truly portfolio diversity?
We think so. There's certainly periods where it's not true, but we do think over the longer time frame that it does pay out. And there's talented people everywhere, so we want to go find them wherever they are.
I'm curious about your cash positions right now, and I'm going to save you for last because I know your answer. I'll start with you, Steve. Just in terms of your current allocation, in terms of what's required, the max required, and what you currently have right now.
We have a maximum exposure to cash of just 0.5% of 1%.
Okay.
And we're a little under that.
Okay.
Again, we try to be more strategic, and we try to adhere to our strategic asset allocation to be on the efficient frontier over time. We have a rebalancing exercise on a weekly basis, which we're reevaluating whether that's too frequent or not. But for us, again, cash is still, even though it's yielding 4.30-ish, it's still a bit of a cash drag when you can compare it to other things in your portfolio that can deliver hopefully double-digit returns over time.
You keep it towards the minimum then.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, and so like our cash position is nominal, but again, our annual net distribution is less than a percentage of our NAV, and so we're plenty covered by kind of 20, 30, 40x T+1 money. So it's just not something that keeps us up at night, because obviously the draconian situation you want to avoid is having to sell your private market assets at steep discounts, to satiate kind of your annual liability payment. And so I think we're blessed to be, kind of 90+% funded, and also to be serving Texan cities that are net growing, right? And so I think from that standpoint, it really empowers us to harvest a liquidity premium over the long term and really play the best offense we can.
All right, and that brings us to you. You are negative cash.
Yes, so we are, I mean, you could think about it as negative cash. We actually have portfolio leverage. So we lever our entire portfolio about 13%. So we increase the risk through leverage and then somewhat decrease the risks through having a bigger fixed income portfolio than you might otherwise. So that's the way that we get on the efficient frontier. And we use that cash that we're borrowing both to across the entire portfolio, but in investment grade and high yield and private credit, we can increase there's a spread there. So it's we've found that to be a helpful part of our portfolio construction.
A question to all three of you. Has your job gotten more difficult as of late? Or are you finding maybe there's a little bit more of a wind at your back?
I don't feel like I have a wind at my back.
Okay.
So just for the record, and anyone here that's a New York City resident, this is the best job I've ever had in my career. And I'm sorry to say I've been at this 42 years. I know you just turned 40, but I've been at this for a while. It's wonderful. It's a privilege to serve. I feel the attachment to the people, to the firefighters and the police officers when I see them on the street. I don't know. I mean, there's obviously an increased element of volatility. There's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. The markets hate uncertainty. But again, our North Star is our strategic asset allocation. And as long as we adhere to that and don't overreact to rhetoric out of Washington or volatility in the markets, I think we'll be fine longer term.
New Yorkers are tough. I assume Wisconsinites that you deal with are a lot nicer, right?
We are Wisconsinites, yes. It's, I would, to answer the other question, it always feels tough, right? It always feels like it's the toughest it's ever been, and it always seems like in the past it was easy. It's never easy, and I would echo what Stephen said in just, we also try to focus on the strategic and think long-term and not overreact to any particular day's move.
Right. Yeah, I think attracting and retaining kind of world-class talent is number one. It's my number one job, and also as a result, attracting and partnering with the best investment managers kind of comes next. And so I do think it's truly one of the best jobs in the world, and we are living in exciting times right now, and the implications of our investing will have kind of really amplified kind of implications for the future. And so I do think it's the best job in the world.
All right, well, after having spending some time with all three of you, I think the public's money is in good hands. Thanks to all three of you.
Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Purnima Puri, Governing Partner and Portfolio Manager for Public Credit at HPS Investment Partners, and Tom Wagner, co-founder and co-managing member at Knighthead Capital Management, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Pat Regnier and Sonali Basak.
Hi, it's great to see everybody here. The subject of this panel is the next big risk. I think a lot of people in this room, if you ask what the next big risk is right now, they'd say Thursday. And the next big risk after that is Friday. And the risk after that is going to be whatever happens over the weekend that's going to keep us on our computers. But let's try to pull back from the day-to-day a little bit and just talk about what risks you see in your seats over, let's just say, the next year. What are the structural risks or the tensions in the economy and in the markets that are worrying you most right now? Tom, maybe I'll start with you. You've kind of talked about you're worried about mispricing of risk right now.
Yeah, I think that well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure. I think that the market is pricing asset risk, if not to perfection, very, very favorably against a fairly uncertain economic and geopolitical backdrop. And while I have a pretty strong sense as to how things will end, the timing is a bit uncertain. And when in the context of thinking about the next year, that makes it a difficult conversation. It's, the risk to reward is not great over the next year. Looking out longer term, which is how we try to think about our portfolio because of the nature of our asset liability matching, looking out over 5 years, I'm constructive as it relates to the broad macroeconomic and geopolitical landscape because I think that things will get better in the context of geopolitics and in the context of the economy. I think that they'll continue to move along fairly well, and I do believe that some of the technological innovation that we're beginning to see really take hold will lead to lower inflation, all things being equal. So I think we all know the attendant risks that are facing the economy today. They're kind of right there in your face. But I think it's, as we manage the portfolio, we're trying to look a bit further out.
Maria, you said you know how it ends. So I want to just skip forward to that. So when you're saying that this idea that we're going to come to a constructive place is how you're hoping it's going to end?
I mean, we can just, let's just talk about it directly, right? We have somebody who's negotiating, our president's negotiating in a very unusual fashion. But I think we have to think about what each side has to gain and lose. As it relates to our major trading partners of Canada, Mexico, and China, it's a drug issue, okay? And the risks to the U.S. are extraordinary, and it's not necessarily directly related to those three countries, but there are things that they can do to help mitigate that significant risk. Second is probably immigration and controlling immigration so that we're ensuring that our immigration policy aligns with our broad economic policies. Those are relatively easy things to solve, and while the approach has been very, very dramatic, when you think about what each side is trying to achieve, it's not difficult to imagine that it ends reasonably quickly and without any major disruptions to the economy. And so when you look at it through that lens, it's a bit different. We get caught up in the trading atmosphere because the markets are going up and down dramatically. I mean, there's been no impact in any of our portfolios in the last week, and I don't think there'll be any impact in the next month. And so long as things don't drag on for many, many months, I don't see anything that causes me great concern.
Tom, when you say mispriced assets out there, Purnima, I'm wondering how you view that dynamic and if it's another way of saying valuations are stretched and they're stretched in too many places.
I think a couple of things. I agree with you that spreads are super tight. So I'm start with that. Why are they super tight? Because there's been so much technical demand and the numbers are there. I mean, in the loan market, I think it's $160 billion of CLO new capital raised since 21, and the loan market's grown by $50 billion. So this is math, right? Three is that the power of compounding. So all these portfolios generated a lot of income last year, and there was no new supply. All the supply in the marketplace has all been refinancing. When I say all, it's 80 to 85%, but basically all of it. So the spread compression is really technically driven, and I don't know when that's going to shift because we came into the year with a lot of people feeling like there'd be a lot of M&A activity, and that's questionable. Why is it questionable? Because people need to be able to have a scope of being able to underwrite a plan. And I think the uncertainty, people don't like uncertainty. No one likes uncertainty. And there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that are uncertain. Your question was on specifically, what do we care about this year? And I suspect you guys are focused on the same thing. But if this goes to a place where growth gets curtailed too much and inflation remains sticky, that's not good for any company. So that's what we're worried about.
Bad.
Are we headed there?
No.
Okay.
I mean, we were talking earlier. It's just that when we were on camera. If I told everyone that we had a problem at our border that resulted in terrorists crossing the border and killing 2 innocent Americans every day, what would we do? Would we take really extreme action to stop that? Well, what's crossing our border every day is killing 200 Americans. 250,000 people lost to fentanyl since 2018. We have to take some kind of significant action because that's a massive crisis on many, many levels. Economically, it's incredibly costly. From a pure humanitarian perspective, it's an awful dynamic, and it's concentrated in our poorest communities. So, if nothing else has worked yet. So personally, I'm in favor of doing something dramatic and bold and maybe a bit disruptive to try to correct for something that really needs. We got to start making some progress on this. And yes, a lot of the driving forces behind it are here. But if we have to suffer a period of economic uncertainty to make progress on something that's so awful from a humanitarian perspective, I think that's an okay.
Are we sure that these tariff talks are really about that? I think it's always a little hard to separate the performativity, the theatricality of what's happening with the issues that are actually on the table.
Well, you got to take away the theatrics, because every time we get sucked into the theatrics of our president, we lose sight of what's actually going on. And that, by the way, a lot of bad investment decisions have been made on that basis, either misinterpreting his actual popularity or the underlying policies. I don't think anybody's going to raise their hand and say, "Oh, I love the theatrics." I've never met anybody who does. But generally speaking, when there's a repeated comment as to what the driving force or desire is, it's usually factually accurate, and he keeps talking about it being a drug issue. We had, for all the hysteria yesterday about what was coming in tariffs, there was a comment made late day about, we're going to kick the can, and a reiteration of what the driving force is. So that's why I think you, as an investor, you have to focus on what are the actual things that are influencing each side. There's an easy solution here. These are small wins that are being sought.
So that's the near term. Let's put a pin in it. Let's look to the long term as well, because a lot of the reason we do this project, it's called the Next Big Risk, we do it twice a year with the biggest investors, is because you're not really underwriting to tomorrow. You're underwriting to the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years, maybe longer, depending on what kind of investor you are. Purnima, when you think about the next 10 to 15 years, say, what is the biggest risk? What's the biggest unknown that you have to factor in your decision making?
Growth. I think growth is the biggest risk. People have come out, Besant's come out and said we're shooting for a 3% deficit and 3% growth. And 3% growth is, we need to believe either that you're going to get it through productivity or through a combination of productivity and population. Those are the only two things that can make the world grow and make the U.S. grow. So I think growth is the biggest risk over the long term. And there's a whole bunch of, we can double click into all the sort of pieces of that equation. But the relevance of the growth comment is you got a 6.5% deficit. You may or may not have tax cuts that get extended, which would make that deficit grow. The numbers are anywhere from 7 to 10% over the next 10 years of a deficit. The numbers are 122 to 130% of debt to GDP. And those are big numbers. And so why is that relevant? It's relevant because we need people to finance in their long bond. The government needs financing, and none of that's particularly great. So I think growth is your problem, and I worry about labor shortages.
Say more about labor shortages. Why is that so worrying right now?
Well, we may have a different view on some of this, but that's why.
We were kind of making a joke a little earlier. The way this economy is shaping up, it's kind of like less babies, more robots, because people are not having children to increase
People are not
the
having
workforce.
children. The U.S. population, organic population replacement rate right now is at the replacement rate is 2.1 kids per female. And it's running at like 1.3 or 1.4 or something like that. So organically, you're not growing at all. And depending on where we go with immigration, I don't think there's a lot of debate around sort of this criminal immigration and things like that. But immigration has helped grow our economy, and it's been deflationary. And we've immigrated, 8 to 10 million Americans have come into the country in the last 4 years. That has been a buoy to growth. And prior to the last year, productivity growth was, there's all kinds of numbers out there. I think it was like 1.5 or 1.8% or something like that. The McKinsey report had this number. And last year was like 2.2, 2.4%. So, maybe productivity can get you to 3%, but it would be nice to have a little bit of some other levers to pull if you needed to, I think, to enable the economy to grow, because I do think that's the big risk.
How do you invest around that risk?
What our business is we're not a beta business, so let me just start with that. And so, and nor are you guys. So, we underwrite idiosyncratic risk, and we try to underwrite within a band of outcomes. And that band of outcomes over a period of time, which generally turns out to be, anywhere from 3 to 10 years, can look a lot of different ways. But I would say, what are we trying to solve for? We're trying to solve for sustainability in a variety of growth scenarios for capital structures, sustainability in a variety of interest rate scenarios for capital structures, and scenarios in a variety of ways that businesses could get disrupted or industries can get disrupted. So that's how we underwrite risk.
Let's roll back a bit. You said you think you may disagree with Tom a little bit on something. Can we hone in on what that was?
Well, we started down the immigration path, so I was making the point that I think that immigration has been a helpful lever in the economy growing, and I believe that it has been deflationary. And so I think that we got to be careful. And there's the sentiment around immigration has shifted dramatically in the last year.
Yeah. To the point that you were making on productivity, I know, Tom, I really want to flesh this out with you too, because a lot of people are making the assumption that AI will fill the gap on any of the productivity shortfalls. You even had Scott Bessent recently saying that you could see it soon in the economic data, though he didn't specify which economic data. So I know you're investing around this in particular. To the extent that AI is a glory story, what changes and how do you invest around that?
Yeah, this is such a complicated topic. It's hard to distill it down into a quick response. But I think from a very high level, there's never been any material technological innovation or any material increase in compute that hasn't led to a demand for more compute and more technological adoption. So why would AI be any different? Have the products all been fleshed out that work well in the context of some of these LLMs? No. But there's a bigger element that I think is generally lost in the discussion around AI. AI, among the biggest, these trillion-dollar companies, is a race for AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence. And no one really understands yet knows yet what that leads to, except the fact that there's a general consensus, I believe, be fair to say this, that it will lead to increased independent productivity of our machines, right? And then how do you deploy that? Well, I think we'll all work very, very quickly in figuring that out. I mean, I can come up with, dozens of ways across our companies where that can be a better process, by utilizing AI, and a much more efficient process. Now, I'm not negative on the adoption of technology as it relates to human standard of living, right? I think there's plenty of abundance in the world, and there's plenty to go around. We haven't had technological innovations that have materially reduced the standard of living in developed economies, so I don't think this will be any different. But when you start saying, well, is it this quarter or next quarter or the quarter after, no one really knows. What I can say is that the companies that are developing these technologies are not slowing down. I mean, the size of the complexes of compute that are being planned for that'll come out in 3 years, which is what we're investing in, are extraordinarily large.
So you're seeing the opportunity there, but let's talk about the risk of it. We know that technology can just dramatically increase the standard of living, but it's also just can be very disruptive to people's lives. Keynes, I think, wrote that no people or nation has ever looked at a new age of leisure and abundance with anything but dread, because it just breaks so many things. What could AI break?
Okay, well, except that it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, yes, you can use the old saying that if you're a buggy whip manufacturer, cars were a bad thing, but okay, that's always the case for any business that's in secular decline. There's lots of businesses in secular decline, and there's lots of them that we've seen over the course of the last couple of decades. That will continue. But the opportunities that come about as a result of the technological innovation vastly outweigh the impact of the companies that are disrupted because they're behind the technological curve. I just don't believe that this will be any different, and I think the evidence is pretty powerful to suggest otherwise. I mean, you should go online and look at the commentary from the technologists and how they're deploying AI and some of the early advantages that they're able to achieve. It's pretty dramatic. I mean, I know from helping my daughter with her, English lit homework, which I'm terrible at, and using AI, which is perfectly allowed in her school, to help decipher a particular passage. It's unbelievably powerful. Now, that's not necessarily great for overall productivity, but it's starts the wheels turning on where could we utilize this in business.
On that note, I think part of the question here also is not just kind of what can AI do, can it do enough to fill the gap that you're talking about, Purnima? What if it doesn't? What if it doesn't fill the productivity gap? And what if we don't get to a place where population growth is going to start also filling that gap?
I mean, this is a worldwide problem, by the way. This isn't just a U.S. problem. It's a worldwide problem, and people are putting lots of measures in place, and it'll take 20 years to see if it works, right? So, but there's tons of family leave measures that are being put in place, and benefit packages, and forced savings, because you've got the fertility problem, but you have the other side of it too, which is the aging population problem, right? So you got both ends of the spectrum here. Who knows? Like, you know, there's tons of measures. All these countries are doing really interesting things in terms of trying to solve for the organic growth piece of the pie.
And to be clear, you're saying that basically you just need to solve both pieces of the pie.
I think that it's a puzzle. I think there's a huge puzzle on this whole thing because you've got, this is a rabbit hole comment, but you know, you've got a deficit problem where growth is your biggest lever. You've got a budget problem where there's a series of solutions that could include increasing your retirement age. It could include means entitlement testing. You know, there's a whole stuff on that. There's DOGE, which is where can you cut and where can you sort of try to pull this budget back into alignment. And so I don't think there's any one thing that's going to solve this. I think you've got this whole mosaic that we're trying to chip away at so that over a 10-year period, you start to just sort of bend that curve a little bit.
I want to go back to Pat's question also about exact sectors, because you had mentioned to me once before that in the world of private capital, everywhere government has kind of stepped back because they literally cannot pay for things anymore. It's where private capital has stepped in. So where are those areas?
I mean, I think there's so many megatrends to invest in, so I think some of them are related to AI for sure. I mean, you know, we had an investment committee 2 days ago or something like that on, you know, a power plant in data center alley, they call it in Northern Virginia. That was new, I learned that. So, yeah, so, you know, the need for power in certain of these places, that's infrastructure. So I think these megatrends around infrastructure, around AI, whether that be data centers or power, energy transition, there's a whole host of stuff, roads, tolls, which need to be financed. And if you're trying to bend the curve on the deficit, and you have 60% of that budget, which is basically mandatory and fixed, and of that, a lot of that percentage is growing because of an aging population with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, we got to find alternate solutions and alternate providers of capital for the other buckets. And I think that's why you're seeing this trend on private credit and for other people to step in and provide that capital.
Are there any risks around this move to private capital? I mean, we as journalists just have really noticed this change in the structure of markets. And the two things that get our attention is it's a little less transparent, or at least it's less transparent to us. So maybe we're being parochial there. And we hear a lot of talk about financial innovation, which we've all had the experience to know that financial innovation can...
So I have two quick comments, and I'm sure Tom does. But so one is, I don't know about the transparency. So yes, it's less transparent to you. But remember, what are those people that are providing that capital? They're getting monthly financials, actually. There's a ton of transparency for the provider of the capital. There may not be for the externalities, you know, for people that are outside. So that's one thing. And then your second question was what? It was transparency and yes, I know what my answer is. Yeah.
Right.
Securitization's been around forever, right? That's all this is. So we're securitizing cash flows and figuring out where you are in the risk spectrum. That's not new. That's actually not new. It happens to be new and innovative in some of the particular assets you're seeing it in, but that's not new as a concept. Tom?
Before I let you go, I just think that this is such a funky idea. We were talking about it a little bit earlier. You were talking about the megatrends that are in your industry, Purnima. But Tom, one of the megatrends in AI that you have been investing around seems to be a 4-day work week.
Yeah. Okay, so the broad trend, I'll try to do this in 10 seconds. The broad trend is the world digitizes and electrifies. There'll be an increased demand for things that are analog. Okay, one of those is, you know, do you have more time? Do we create more time with productivity so that people have more time to recreate? By the way, that's already happening. It's just not, it's spent in the office on the computer doing things that are not work. It's just a factual answer, and you all know it, right? Like, how much time do we spend? You didn't used to go on and shop at Amazon or Net-a-Porter or whatever these things are, right, and do your stuff during your workday. You work during the workday and do those things afterwards. Now we do a lot of those things during the workday. I think that will continue, and a big theme for us is what are the analog experiences, human analog experiences that we'll see continued interest in over the course of the next couple decades. It was a big driving force behind us getting into a few of our key investments, and it looks like that trend is accelerating.
Yeah, you want to lay out a couple of those investments?
Yeah.
Certainly everything in sport, and then a number of different things in auto. So, auto racing, cars that inspire some level of passion as opposed to, the utilitarian experience you have in an electric vehicle.
I think this is the topic that I'm going to be asking a lot of people about, this 4-day work week. Anyways, thank you guys so very much for having this conversation. Risk is a two-sided coin. So nice to talk to you both about opportunities in this space as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Bruce Flatt, CEO of Brookfield, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. As I think you all know, this is Bruce Flatt. He's the CEO of Brookfield. But Bruce, I wanted to begin by telling everybody here a little bit more about who you are and who I am. Because we're just two Canadian kids sitting here on a stage in New York City wondering what it could have been, what it is that our country could have done to provoke all of these taunts and all of these tariffs. Because Canada it's a gentle place, it's a polite place, it's a beautiful place. Okay, doesn't spend 3% of GDP on defense, but otherwise, it's a pretty inoffensive place. Our compatriots, Bruce, our friends, our families up north, are stunned that this is happening. Are you?
I have no comments. Our business is about finding great countries in the world. America's one of them. Canada's one of them. Australia's one of them. The UK is one of them. Investing, putting people on the ground and investing into the backbone of global infrastructure. So we don't trade. We actually own major backbones in every country in the world, and we sell those services and products in local places. So I guess the real point is our business is unaffected because we're a local investor. We're a $500 billion investor in the United States. We're a $100 billion investor in the UK. We're a $75 billion investor in Canada. We're a $75 billion investor in Australia. What we do is go to countries. What we really need is good rule of law, good backbone infrastructure, major amounts of capital, and we put money in the ground. And that's our business, and it has been for a long, long time, and it continues to be that.
Since 1899?
Since 1899, reformed
several
times over, and 25 years ago, we started the asset management business here to build out with institutional clients, and that's the main asset management business we have today.
There are, however, CEOs who do find themselves in a similar boat to that you find yourself in at the moment. As you just explained, you're the CEO of a company with assets, with operations and employees here in the United States, also in Canada, also in lots of other countries, but specifically, and what I'm getting at here is a shift in trade policy and in foreign policy, but something perhaps a little more fundamental. Do you, and perhaps others as well, have to assume that we have entered, I don't know, a new normal, where countries like Canada and the United States that were allies, longtime allies, may now in fact be economic adversaries? And that new relationship has consequences that you, running a company, have to deal with?
I just say our business is maybe different than a lot of others. We go to countries, we invest in those countries, we sell things to their people and the products within the countries. We generally don't cross borders. As a result of that, all we need is good countries with rule of law and generally positive GDP and backbone infrastructure. Nothing has changed over the past year or 2 years, and I don't think it'll change going forward for what we do.
You do, however, make private equity investments into companies that have cross-border exposure?
Yeah, you know, on balance, not really, because what our private equity businesses are industrial and service businesses generally that operate in countries and sell services in those countries. So, for example, we own the largest battery company in the world. We sell 160 million batteries. We have 50 plants around the world in 35 countries. You can't ship batteries that are, those car batteries, they're pretty heavy. Even though we make the little ones, they're heavy, so they don't ship. And therefore, they're mostly consumed in country.
The local market business.
So it's local market. So our business is about backbone. And backbone means local economy, local people, local investment. So trade really doesn't matter so much to us.
A lot has been made recently, and certainly here over the past 2 days, about the amount of policy uncertainty and volatility. Those things can create opportunities too. Just yesterday, we saw BlackRock lead a $19 billion deal for control of a global ports business, and most notably, of course, that deal includes 2 facilities in Panama that the Trump administration had targeted because of their Chinese ownership. Is that going to be a trend? Forced sales, M&A driven by an urgent need, in this case an urgent need for both the Chinese owners and the Panamanian government to get out of this administration's crosshairs?
Look, the price and value are 2 different things. The value is what you get, the price is what you pay. And volatility creates opportunity around the world for those that are strong and those that have capital to be able to take advantage of opportunities. And as long as you keep your eye on 20 years from now in the businesses that you're running, all of these things will be looked back upon as very short-term items. This will not be, what we're going through today will not be relevant 25 years from today.
It might not be relevant beyond this presidential term.
I'm just telling you, 25 years from now, we're going to look back and it won't be relevant.
You're thinking on that time horizon?
We always think on those time horizons. Everything we do...
Not everybody here can afford to think like that.
Everything we do, or why we're in private markets, is because we buy things for long periods of time. And either we're going to hold them, or it's in a fund where we may have to sell. But what we need to do is to prepare the investment for the next owner that they will accept the next 25 years. And that's really, really important to keep your eye on the long ball.
I know that you are certainly competitive in your industry, competitive as an individual. Sometimes the how of the deal-making process is important. The deal that I just mentioned, this $19 billion deal for these global ports, originated, as we understand it, with a pitch by Larry Fink, of course, who is a peer of yours, who runs BlackRock, directly to the White House. And again, thinking only in terms of the next 4 years, not necessarily 25, from a competitive standpoint, is that the kind of thinking that you have to be operating with in order to be competitive, in order to win? You know, that kind of access and that kind of, I think, under the circumstances, deal-making creativity?
You know, we're building the Intel fabrication plant for $32 billion in Arizona. We just signed a $12 billion Microsoft power contract to build renewables for them, largely in the United States. We just did a large deal in Germany with Deutsche Telekom, with their telecom towers. We just signed a AI deployment data center business in France with the French government for $20 billion. Our business is about facilitating our operating skills and amassing the large sums of money we have to take on opportunities that are significant. And increasingly, there aren't that many people that can compete with us just because of the access to capital that we have.
You're right. There aren't many people who can compete with you. There are few, however, right? Some of them started in different places. Brookfield, for many years, was known as a huge player in real estate and infrastructure, and now, of course, you're also huge in private equity and credit and renewable energy and insurance. But the others, I could name some of them, you know who they are following a similar playbook, right? Trying to give clients everything they could possibly want under one roof, concentrating more and more LP assets. It's been great for your stock price and for their stock prices. Is the future more of the same, which is to say more concentration and more convergence, the biggest firms getting not just bigger, but more alike one another? Or will there be a divergence at some point with, say, a Brookfield and perhaps another firm or two going in one direction and everybody else going in another?
I think over time, if you look at financial services, there's always opportunity for niche players, and there will be always that around the world. But there's increasingly concentration within large-scale players, which, as you note, are probably 5 or 6 today. Maybe it's 7 or 8 over time. And those large players look similar, but they're not exactly the same. And it's how they developed the access, the capital that they have available to be able to deploy their businesses. So they're similar, but then they're not exactly the same. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's just they're a little bit different for various reasons, probably that developed over 25, 30 years.
One of the big differentiators in your industry now is insurance, a huge growth engine for alternative asset managers as a group, Brookfield, of course, included. Why is that business so appealing? Why is it growing so quickly?
One of the last businesses in the financial services industry that had not, it's now turned on its head. We're in the business of, in our insurance business, is finding low-risk liabilities and maximizing the asset value that we can generate on the asset side of the balance sheet. Historically, insurance companies made money from insurance and found somebody to invest their money. So the model's almost been turned like this. And our special ingredient to all of this is that we have $150 billion of capital at our parent company. We've put almost $20 billion into the equity of our insurance business, which we've just sold assets and put that money into the company. And we will continue to do that to build out the business over the next 10 years. So because we have $150 billion of tangible capital, we can grow that business very significantly. And it both helps facilitate, of course, earnings in the insurance business, but drives our whole asset management franchise as well.
So if you were to take the $20+ billion of equity that you have in that insurance business now and add 100 plus?
You know, it ultimately could be all the capital we have up top, which is $150 billion.
That would turn it into an insurance business with what in the way of assets?
It would just be turned up this way. It would be an insurance business owning our asset management and our investment operations, which is really what Berkshire Hathaway is. It's an insurance company that owns investments.
Increasingly also what Apollo has become.
Yes, they don't have an extra $150 billion of capital up top. But yes, exactly
So
that.
if you execute on that plan and we compare Brookfield with Apollo, because it sounds to me like it's at this point or going to be a very useful comparison, what do the two look like at the end of the day?
Look, our business has a very large asset management business, which is $1 trillion of assets under management, a large insurance company that's getting bigger, and a very significant pool of cash and assets that can be turned into cash. What we do with those assets that can be turned into cash, we'll decide over time. They may go into our insurance company if we can find opportunities, or we will redeploy them into some other financial services business, or we'll just keep buying stock back over the next 20 years. We'll have to see where it goes, and it'll all depend on opportunities.
Bruce, you recently predicted that there will be more consolidation in the alternatives industry. Will Brookfield be a buyer as well?
We are at the point where we almost have everything that we want. We have a few very simple metrics for things that could be additive to us, but if something can be additive to us, that we can bring something to a group, and that culturally we can see eye to eye and be partners, we might add in other businesses into Brookfield Asset Management, but we see no real need to pay up for anything at this point in time, just because we have a pretty broad array of products for our clients, and we continue to build those out.
I do want to take a minute and talk to you about AI, in particular because infrastructure is quite obviously to all of us becoming one of the gating factors in the growth of AI. Hundreds and hundreds of billion dollars being committed to AI infrastructure. Brookfield is a player. What's your commitment to date, and what role do you see yourselves playing over time?
So we are the largest private builder of renewable power in the world. We're among the top 3 largest builders of data centers in the world. And we're continuing to morph the model into funding compute capacity for the technology groups. The number one thing that stands between us achieving all of the models that will drive the AI revolution and productivity advances is the backbone of infrastructure around the world. It's the singular one thing. And so we continue to put enormous amounts of money behind these businesses. And it's largely because our view is that the productivity advances that are going to come out of AI models in advanced robotics and services are going to be unprecedented over the next 20 years. And what that means is we're in the midst, in the United States, but also globally, we're in the midst of this enormous investment era, but it's going into highly productive investment, which is going to lead to very significant productivity advances. We're talking 50 to 100% returns on capital, where we have seen deployment of some of these things on early test cases.
Does it matter where you are? Does it matter who you're partnered with?
Firstly, what's really important and why this is so exciting for our business is it's not if you have a model today, it's whether you have compute capacity, which requires data centers and power. And that's what's super, super important, and that's what's going to matter in the future. So we're spending, like, all of our capacity is committed for 20 years. We haven't even built some of it yet, but it's all committed for 20 years. We're entitling new sites around the world, but in particular in the US, which is going to be used for artificial intelligence models and learning, and this is very, very significant investment.
Much of this is being powered by renewable energy. Brookfield is a giant in renewables. Until recently, you had a high-profile chairman in that business named Mark Carney. He's now, of course, running for the leadership of Canada's Liberal Party, and probably, as of today, will end up being, if only for a period of time, the next prime minister, at least until the next election. What can you tell us about Mark? You've seen him run a business. Would he be good at running a country?
He will be an excellent prime minister of Canada. He's passionate about what he does. He listens to people, and he will do an excellent job.
Specifically about renewables, I know you listened to the State of the Union last night. I did as well. The president spent a fair bit of time talking about his achievements, among them, killing the federal EV mandate, bringing back drill baby drill to the oil industry. Does this, in your mind, pose a setback for renewables, to the energy transition, to transition finance, where Mark himself and Brookfield play an important role, and ultimately to decarbonizing the atmosphere? So, remember, oil is used in cars and planes. It's not used in power.
We were always in favor of oil.
Gas is used in power, though.
Gas is used in power, and we were always in favor of gas because we need gas as a bridge fuel, and we're exporting it, and countries around the world need it to get rid of coal. Third, and this is really important, in the United States and in most countries of the world, solar and wind are the lowest cost power there is. When you have the lowest cost power, people buy it from you. Today, people just need power. They need any power. They need power from solar, they need power from wind, they need power from gas, they need power from nuclear, they need it from everywhere because we're going to double the electricity stack in the next 20 years, and it's impossible to get there without all of these. So I think what's being done today is smart, but it doesn't matter for renewables. It's all still getting built.
There's only one thing standing between us and lunch, and that is the last word from Bruce Flatt. Bruce, with somebody who looks at the world with a 25-year investment horizon, at a time when so many people, perhaps some of you in this room, might be uneasy, freaking out perhaps, about the state of things, what's the single most valuable piece of advice you could give them?
Stay focused on the long ball. Nothing else matters.
There you have it, folks. Bruce Flatt.
Thank you so much to Eric and Bruce, and thank you to all of our speakers and moderators, and thank you all for being such a fantastic audience. Another big thank you to our sponsors, our title sponsor, Invesco QQQ, our presenting sponsor, Mass Mutual, and our supporting sponsor, TIAA. Please stay for lunch. Before you have to head off, finish your work days. Lunch is out these doors and downstairs. And also downstairs, visit Invesco QQQ and their activation Race for Innovation. You can revisit any of our conversations you heard here by going to our YouTube channel at Bloomberg Live. And to see more of our events, head to bloomberglive.com. You'll see a few great ones coming up, including, I'm so excited, Bloomberg Invest in Hong Kong in June. I do hope you stick around for lunch and that you have enjoyed the last 2 days. We love your feedback. Keep it coming. And we will see you back here in March of 2026. You planned for a year. You're so sad it's over, but I hope you had a great time.